When we think about history, we usually picture the big moments, the famous battles, the grand empires, the towering figures who shaped entire eras. But just beneath those headline events lies another layer of history. Quieter, lesser-known moments that had surprisingly deep and lasting effects. These are the kinds of events that don't always make it into school textbooks, yet they helped shape the world we live in today. This essay explores 25 of those forgotten turning points, spanning from the medieval era all the way to the late 20th century. Each story looks at what happened, why it mattered, and how its influence spread across regions and generations. The goal is not to dazzle with obscure trivia, but to reveal how these moments acted as hidden hinges, quietly reshaping societies, cultures, and technologies in ways that were often more profound than anyone at the time could have imagined. Some of these stories involve dramatic natural events. For example, in the year 536, a massive volcanic eruption filled the sky with ash and triggered what some historians describe as one of the most difficult periods to live through, bringing famine and disease in its wake. Others show how technology transformed the flow of knowledge, like the revolutionary printing press of the 1430s that suddenly made ideas accessible to ordinary people. There were also global climate shocks, such as the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, which cooled the earth and disrupted societies far beyond its immediate location. And then there were moments when local events sparked something much bigger, like the Velvet Revolution in 1989 Czechoslovakia, which demonstrated to the world that entrenched political systems could be overturned through peaceful means. Our journey will take us from the bustling intellectual centers of Abbasid Baghdad to the imperial courts of Ming China, from the scholarship of medieval Mali to the political transformations of 20th century Africa. Along the way, we'll see political intrigue, cultural revolutions, scientific breakthroughs, and environmental shocks that connected continents in unexpected ways. Each story draws on credible historical research, ensuring that the narrative remains grounded in evidence rather than myth or speculation. By revisiting these overlooked episodes, we gain a richer understanding of how history actually unfolds, not only through famous leaders and battles, but also through quiet shifts, chance events, and innovations that ripple outward over centuries. These moments remind us that history's biggest changes often start in places we might not expect.
Number 1. The Dark Year, 536 AD, Global Climate Event. Imagine waking up one morning to find the world dimmer than usual. The sun is still there, but it looks faint and pale, as if someone has draped a dusty veil across the sky. Days pass, weeks roll on, and the light never fully returns. Crops start to wither, people shiver in the middle of summer, and no one understands why. This isn't a scene from a dystopian novel, it's real history. The year was 536 AD, and for many, it marked the beginning of one of the harshest periods to be alive. Across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, people looked up in confusion and fear. Ancient writers described how the sun dimmed for a staggering 18 months. It wasn't an eclipse. It wasn't winter. It was something far stranger, a mysterious veil of dust that hung in the atmosphere and refused to move on. Imagine living in a time without satellites, weather reports, or scientific explanations. To people then, this must have felt like a divine punishment or the end of the world. Today, scientists believe this eerie dimming was triggered by a massive volcanic eruption, most likely in Iceland. The explosion was so powerful that it hurled vast amounts of ash and fine particles into the upper atmosphere, forming a global sun-blocking haze. And it didn't stop there. Additional eruptions followed in 540 and 547, compounding the effects and plunging the Earth into what researchers later called the Late Antique Little Ice Age. Evidence from tree rings and ice cores shows a sudden, sharp drop in global temperatures starting in 536, a climate anomaly that lasted for years. The consequences were devastating. Average temperatures fell by just a few degrees, but that was enough to throw entire ecosystems off balance. Summers became unnaturally cold. Fields that normally yielded plenty of grain turned barren. Think of the famous year without a summer in 1816, caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora. But then imagine something similar happening more than 1,000 years earlier in a world with far less capacity to cope. Harvests failed, food stores dwindled, and famine spread across continents. In Egypt, bread, usually a staple, became a luxury. Prices skyrocketed, making basic survival a daily struggle. Hunger turned into unrest as communities fought to stretch dwindling resources. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, and by 541, the world faced a new catastrophe, the Justinian Plague. This deadly pandemic swept through the Byzantine Empire, killing millions. The cold and hunger created perfect conditions for disease to spread. Crowded cities with weakened populations were easy targets. It's chilling to realize that a volcanic eruption on a remote island may have helped spark one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. The historian Michael McCormick famously called 536 the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, and for good reason. What began as a geological event cascaded into a multi-layered global crisis. Economies faltered as trade networks suffered from crop failures and unrest. Empires, already stretched thin, found their foundations cracking. In India, the Gupta Empire began to unravel. In Europe, population movements accelerated, with groups like the Lombards eventually pushing into Italy. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a chain reaction set in motion by the darkened skies of 536. This moment in history is a powerful reminder of how fragile societies can be when faced with sudden environmental shocks. In a pre-industrial world, there was little ability to mitigate climate disruptions. A cold summer meant starvation, not just inconvenience. Political structures depended on stable food supplies and functioning trade. Once those faltered, everything from military strength to cultural stability was at risk. The volcanic veil didn't just cool the air, it shifted the trajectory of civilizations. What makes this story even more compelling is how we know all of this today. It's not just based on old myths or vague tales. Contemporary Byzantine chroniclers wrote about the dim sun and the bitter cold. Meanwhile, scientists have drilled deep into ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, finding clear chemical signatures, spikes in volcanic aerosols, that match the timeline of these historical accounts. Tree rings from that era show stunted growth, confirming the global cooling. Historians and climate scientists have pieced together these clues like detectives solving an ancient mystery. Why should we care about something that happened nearly 1,500 years ago? Because the dark year of 536 is an early, striking example of how climate events can ripple through human societies.
A single volcanic eruption didn't just chill the air, it destabilized economies, fueled migrations, and possibly accelerated the fall of empires. In our modern interconnected world, a major eruption could still disrupt global food systems, air travel, and supply chains, albeit in different ways. The difference is that today we understand the mechanisms behind these events. But the lesson remains. Nature can reshape human history in ways we often underestimate. So the next time you hear about a volcanic eruption on the news, remember 536 AD. A dusty sky once changed the course of civilizations, reminding us that even the most powerful empires can falter when the sun itself seems to dim.
Number 2. Abbasid adoption of paper, 8th to 9th centuries, Middle East.
Picture a bustling medieval marketplace in Baghdad. The air is warm and dry, filled with the sound of chatter, the clatter of carts, and the rhythmic scratch of pens on paper. Stall after stall is piled high with sheets of crisp white paper. Scribes lean over wooden desks, copying manuscripts with practiced hands. Bookshops line the streets, their shelves heavy with works of poetry, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. This was no ordinary marketplace. It was the beating heart of a knowledge revolution. And it all began with a technological transfer that stretched across continents. Let's rewind a little. Paper was invented in China during the 2nd century AD. For centuries, it remained a closely held innovation of the East, spreading gradually within Asia, but not beyond. The Islamic world at this point relied mostly on parchment made from animal skins and on papyrus from Egypt, both expensive and time-consuming to produce. Books were precious, manuscripts rare, and written communication was often limited to administrative elites. But in 751 AD, something happened that would change the course of history. The Battle of Talas. The Abbasid Caliphate and the Tang dynasty faced off near the Talas River in what is now modern-day Kyrgyzstan. The Abbasids emerged victorious. According to traditional accounts, among the prisoners captured by the Abbasids were Chinese artisans skilled in the craft of papermaking. Whether the story unfolded exactly this way or through other channels of cultural exchange, the result was the same. The secret of papermaking began its journey westward. By 762 AD, the Abbasid Caliphate had moved its capital to Baghdad, a city that would soon become a global intellectual powerhouse. As the administrative and cultural center of a vast empire, Baghdad had enormous bureaucratic needs. Tax records, legal documents, religious texts, scientific treatises, all required reliable and affordable writing materials. The caliphs saw the potential of paper immediately. Unlike parchment, which required animal hides, or papyrus, which depended on fragile reeds, paper could be made in large quantities from more accessible materials like linen rags. It was cheaper, lighter, and easier to store, making it perfect for an empire that thrived on communication and record-keeping. Around 794 AD, Baghdad established its first large-scale paper mill. This wasn't a small workshop tucked away in a corner. It was a full-fledged industry. UNESCO records describe how by the late 8th century, Baghdad's streets were lined with up to 100 paper shops and booksellers. Imagine walking through a neighborhood where every other storefront offers books, blank paper, or beautiful calligraphy supplies. It must have felt like stepping into a living library. For scholars and scribes, this abundance was revolutionary. Suddenly, copying books wasn't the work of months or years, it became routine. Ideas could travel further, faster, and more widely than ever before. The impact was immediate and profound. With paper widely available, the Islamic world entered a period of extraordinary intellectual flourishing. Historians often call this the Islamic Golden Age, a time when knowledge blossomed across fields like astronomy, medicine, mathematics, literature, and philosophy. Libraries grew into vast repositories of wisdom, attracting scholars from across the known world. Works on algebra, like those by Al-Khwarizmi, spread widely. Medical treatises circulated among physicians. Poets found new audiences. Even popular fiction, stories like 1001 Nights, benefited from the ease of copying and sharing. But this wasn't just a regional phenomenon. The technology of papermaking spread outward from Baghdad like ripples in a pond. From the Middle East, it reached North Africa, then crossed into Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, where it encountered the intellectual currents of Europe. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Europeans were learning papermaking techniques from Islamic craftsmen. This transfer of knowledge would prove to be one of the stepping stones to the European Renaissance. Without abundant, affordable paper, the later rise of universities, mass copying of classical texts, and eventually the printing press might have been delayed by centuries. The paper revolution also transformed governance. Empires thrive on information, on the ability to keep records, issue decrees, collect taxes, and administer justice. With paper, the Abbasid bureaucracy became more efficient and expansive. Legal contracts, scientific data, trade records, all were written, copied, and stored with unprecedented ease. A single innovation, born in China and nurtured in Baghdad, ended up reshaping administrative systems across Afro-Eurasia. What's striking is how this transformation started with just a handful of artisans, or perhaps even a single workshop, and then spread through trade, scholarship, and statecraft. Historians trace its impact through chronicles describing Baghdad's thriving paper markets and through the sheer volume of surviving manuscripts from the era. It's no exaggeration to say that Baghdad became the intellectual capital of the world, and paper was the foundation upon which that reputation was built. When we think about technological revolutions, we often picture printing presses, steam engines, or the internet. But long before any of these, paper itself was a revolutionary technology. Its adoption by the Abbasids didn't just change how people wrote, it changed how they thought, how they governed, and how they shared ideas. It turned cities into centers of learning, linked civilizations together, and laid the groundwork for centuries of scientific and cultural advancement.
Number 3. The House of Wisdom. 8th to 9th centuries. Abbasid Baghdad. Imagine a city where knowledge is treated like treasure. where scholars from every corner of the known world gather to debate ideas, translate ancient texts, and push the boundaries of human understanding. That city was Baghdad, and at its heart stood one of the most remarkable institutions of the medieval world, the House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah. Let's set the scene. It's the early 800s. Baghdad is the glittering capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, a city of canals, bustling markets, and dazzling architecture. Under Caliph Harun al-Rashid, and even more so his son al-Mamun, the Abbasid court embraced learning as a cornerstone of power and prestige. They didn't just build palaces, they built places to think. Attached to the caliph's palace was a grand library and academy, the House of Wisdom. This wasn't merely a collection of books gathering dust. It was a living, breathing center of scholarship, deliberately designed to bring together knowledge from across the known world. At the time, the Islamic Empire spanned vast territories, linking lands from Spain to Central Asia. With such reach came access to diverse intellectual traditions: Greek philosophy, Persian science, Indian mathematics, Syriac medical knowledge. The Abbasids recognized this as a priceless inheritance. Under al-Mamun's leadership, translation became a state-sponsored mission. Teams of scholars scoured the Byzantine Empire and beyond to find manuscripts of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Ptolemy, and many others. Once these works arrived in Baghdad, translators, often working in teams across languages like Greek, Syriac, and Arabic, rendered them into Arabic so they could be studied, debated, and built upon. What made this even more extraordinary was the diversity of the scholars themselves. Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and even Zoroastrian intellectuals worked side by side, united not by creed but by curiosity. Imagine walking through the halls of the House of Wisdom at its height. Long corridors filled with shelves of manuscripts, the sound of pens scratching on paper, translators debating the correct wording of a philosophical concept, mathematicians solving equations on wax tablets, astronomers poring over star charts. It was, in many ways, the medieval world's closest equivalent to a modern research university. Some of the greatest minds of the era were associated with this intellectual movement. Al-Kindi, often called the philosopher of the Arabs, sought to harmonize Greek philosophy with Islamic thought. Al-Khwarizmi, the brilliant mathematician whose name gave us the word algorithm, worked on groundbreaking treatises that laid the foundations of algebra. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Nestorian Christian scholar, was a master translator of Greek medical texts into Arabic, making the knowledge of Galen and Hippocrates accessible to generations of physicians in the Islamic world and beyond. These were not isolated geniuses. They thrived within the vibrant scholarly ecosystem that institutions like the House of Wisdom fostered. The House of Wisdom also played a crucial role as a library. Manuscripts brought from faraway lands were copied, catalogued, and preserved. In a world before printing presses, this was no small feat. Copying a book required patience, skill, and resources. But the Abbasids understood the power of multiplying knowledge. Every copied manuscript meant another scholar could study it, another library could house it, and another generation could learn from it. Over time, Baghdad earned a reputation as the city of books. Travelers described its streets filled with bookstores, paper shops, and lively debates, evidence of a society where intellectual life flourished. The influence of the House of Wisdom rippled far beyond Baghdad. Its success inspired other rulers and wealthy patrons to establish their own libraries and academies. In Cordoba, Cairo, and other cities, magnificent collections of books arose, often modeled after the Abbasid example. As translations accumulated and scholarship flourished, Greek science and philosophy, much of which had been forgotten in medieval Europe, was not only preserved but expanded upon. These Arabic translations would later find their way back to Europe through places like Islamic Spain and Sicily, sparking new waves of learning that laid crucial groundwork for the Renaissance. It's important to note that not every single translation or intellectual breakthrough happened within the walls of the House of Wisdom itself. The translation movement was broad, spanning multiple cities and networks. But the House of Wisdom became the symbol, the beating heart of this extraordinary intellectual era. It represented what happens when a civilization makes knowledge a priority, when it funds translators, values scholarship, and sees ideas as a form of power. The legacy of the House of Wisdom is difficult to overstate. By institutionalizing learning and translation, it helped bridge the gap between ancient knowledge and the modern world. It showed that when governments and elites support scholarship, entire societies can be transformed. Mathematics advanced, medicine improved, astronomy flourished, philosophy deepened. The House of Wisdom became a model that other cultures, consciously or not, would emulate in the centuries to come. Today, when we think about the great centers of learning, like Oxford, Harvard, or the Sorbonne, it's worth remembering that over 1,000 years ago, Baghdad had its own hub of global scholarship. Its scholars laid intellectual foundations that we still build upon. The House of Wisdom reminds us that knowledge is not bound by geography or religion. It flows through translation, conversation, and curiosity. And sometimes, all it takes is the vision of a few leaders and the passion of many thinkers to change the intellectual course of humanity.
Number 4. Sack of Baghdad, 1258. Mongol invasion. Imagine living in one of the most dazzling cities on Earth, a place where scholars debate philosophy under golden domes, where poets share their verses by the river, and where libraries overflow with knowledge gathered over centuries. That city was Baghdad in the 13th century, the beating heart of the Islamic world. But in early 1558, everything changed. In January of that year, Mongol armies under Hulagu Khan appeared on the horizon. These weren't just any invaders. The Mongols had already swept through vast stretches of Asia, leaving broken kingdoms in their wake. Hulagu sent a message to the Abbasid Caliph, demanding submission. But the Abbasids, proud rulers of a centuries-old dynasty, refused. Baghdad had stood as a symbol of strength and culture for generations. Surely, they thought, their walls would protect them. They were wrong. The siege that followed was shockingly brief, but utterly devastating. On February 10th, after only a few weeks, the Mongols breached the city's defenses, helped by betrayal from within. Once the gates opened, the floodgates of destruction followed. The great city that had flourished under the Abbasids for over 500 years was about to face one of the darkest moments in its history. What happened next is almost too grim to imagine. Mongol soldiers poured through the streets, cutting down anyone in their path. Tens of thousands of people, men, women, and children, were killed. Members of the caliphal family, once surrounded by unimaginable luxury, were executed. The caliph himself met a brutal end. But the tragedy didn't stop with human lives. Baghdad was not only a political capital, it was a center of global knowledge. The city's libraries were legendary, especially the House of Wisdom. This wasn't just a building filled with books. It was a hub of translation, science, philosophy, mathematics, and medicine. Scholars had spent generations collecting and translating works from Greek, Persian, Indian, and Arab traditions. It was, in many ways, the brain of the medieval world. When the Mongols entered, that brain was smashed. Chroniclers wrote of books being hurled into the Tigris River, their ink turning the waters black. One famous story, likely exaggerated but powerfully symbolic, claims that so many manuscripts were thrown into the river that they formed a bridge strong enough for a man on horseback to cross. Whether or not that's literally true, the image captures the scale of the cultural annihilation. Entire collections of ancient knowledge, built up painstakingly over centuries, vanished in days, either burned to ashes or drowned in the current. The sack of Baghdad wasn't just the fall of a city, it was the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. For centuries, the Abbasids had represented the unity of the Islamic world. Their fall left a political vacuum. Across the region, scholars scattered, intellectual networks broke apart, and the once centralized world of Islamic scholarship fractured. The ripple effects of this single event were enormous. In the short term, the Mongols established control over Persia through the Ilkhanate. Egypt and Syria soon fell under Mamluk rule. In Europe, the news sent shockwaves. The Mongols had proven they could topple one of the greatest civilizations of the age. And in the longer term, the loss of Baghdad's scholarly infrastructure changed the trajectory of global knowledge. Think about this. Before 1258, Baghdad had been a place where science and philosophy flourished. After its destruction, the Arab world lost its intellectual capital. Scientific progress slowed, and the heart of innovation shifted elsewhere. Meanwhile, in Europe, a new intellectual movement was beginning to stir, the Renaissance. Much of the classical knowledge that fueled it had originally been preserved and expanded by Muslim scholars, often in Baghdad itself. Now, ironically, as the Islamic world was plunged into fragmentation, Europe was about to experience a cultural rebirth, partly built on that earlier legacy. For Muslims at the time, the fall of Baghdad was almost unimaginable, a civilizational trauma. Later empires, like the Ottomans, would rise, but the unified Abbasid center was gone forever. Historians today view the sack of Baghdad as both the climax of Mongol conquest and one of history's most striking examples of how war can wipe out centuries of accumulated culture in a single stroke. Medieval chroniclers like Ibn al-Athir describe the devastation in harrowing detail, and modern historians emphasize the scale of intellectual loss. Rare Greek and Arabic texts that might have altered future discoveries simply disappeared. The exact numbers will always be debated, but the impact is clear. The world changed in 1258. Power shifted, trade routes were disrupted, and the flow of knowledge took new directions. One great center of civilization was silenced, leaving echoes that still shape history today.
Number 5. Zheng Shi's Voyages, 1405 to 1433, Ming China to Indian Ocean. Imagine a time when the world's oceans were still largely uncharted by Europeans, when most people in Europe had no idea what lay beyond their familiar coasts. Now picture thousands of kilometers away, an emperor in China deciding to build the biggest wooden ships the world had ever seen, not for war or conquest, but to send them on peaceful yet powerful missions across the seas. This isn't the age of Columbus or Vasco da Gama. This is decades earlier. We're talking about the early 1400s, under the rule of the Yongle Emperor of the Ming dynasty. In 1405, he launched the first of 7 massive naval expeditions led by a man who would become legendary,
Admiral Zheng He. Zheng He was not just any sailor. He was a trusted eunuch admiral who commanded a fleet so vast and advanced that it's hard to believe it existed 6 centuries ago. Some of the treasure ships were said to be over 120 meters long, towering over any European vessel of the time. These floating cities carried sailors, soldiers, translators, doctors, navigators, and even officials who would act as the emperor's envoys abroad. The voyages were made possible because, after years of internal turmoil, China had finally regained stability. And with that stability came ambition, the ambition to show the world the glory of Ming China. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He led these fleets on 7 epic journeys that took them through Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent, the Persian Gulf, and all the way to the east coast of Africa. Think about that for a moment. Chinese ships reaching Kenya nearly a century before Europeans did. Along the way, they visited around 30 different countries, creating a network of diplomatic and trade relations that stretched across the Indian Ocean. Wherever they went, Zheng He's fleets dazzled local rulers with silk, porcelain, and gunpowder, exchanging them for exotic spices, precious stones, and animals unlike anything seen in China before. One of the most famous gifts was a giraffe from the far-off kingdom of Malindi on the Kenyan coast. When it was presented to the Ming court, people believed it was a mythical creature, a qilin, a symbol of peace and prosperity. Imagine the scene. A long-necked African giraffe strolling through the imperial palace, greeted with awe and reverence. But these voyages weren't just about exchanging gifts. They were also about projecting power and securing influence. Chinese fleets fought off pirates in Southeast Asian waters, asserted dominance in contested ports, and demonstrated that China wasn't just a land power, it was a maritime superpower too. At their peak, these voyages elevated China's political influence to unprecedented levels. Local rulers sent envoys and tribute missions to Nanjing, eager to maintain good relations with this formidable power from the East. And here's the really fascinating part. All of this happened decades before Portugal's explorers even set sail for Asia. Chinese navigational knowledge and maps were far more advanced than Europe's at the time. Their cartographers created charts that accurately depicted coastlines Europeans wouldn't properly map for another century. One surviving document, known as the Mao Kun Map, offers a glimpse into the routes Zheng He's fleets took, an incredible piece of evidence of their reach and precision. Despite their scale and success, Zheng He's voyages gradually faded from public memory both inside and outside China. But their impact was enormous. These expeditions linked East Asia to the Muslim world and Africa, building trade networks that moved not just goods, but also ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. They boosted China's prestige internationally, and temporarily placed the Ming court at the center of a vast diplomatic web. Technologically, the voyages showed the full might of Chinese shipbuilding and navigation, skills that would sadly diminish in later centuries when isolationist policies took hold. And on a global scale, Zheng He's expeditions were a kind of prelude to the age of discovery. They were a demonstration that large-scale, state-sponsored exploration didn't start in Europe. It had already been happening on a massive scale under Ming China. Today, Zheng He is often remembered as a forgotten pioneer of global trade and diplomacy. His journeys remind us that history isn't always written by those who did it first. It's often written by those who did it last or loudest. While Europe would later dominate maritime exploration,
China's voyages challenged the simple narrative that global exploration was a purely Western phenomenon. Historians rely on court records, inscriptions, and poems from the time to reconstruct the details of these voyages. They tell a story of ambition, innovation, and vision on a scale that was centuries ahead of its time. And while China would soon turn inward, abandoning these grand expeditions, the legacy of Zheng He's voyages endures, as a reminder of a moment when Chinese sails filled the winds of the Indian Ocean, connecting worlds long before the familiar names of European explorers ever set out.
Number 6. Gutenberg's printing press, circa 1436, Mainz, Germany. Picture this. It's the early 1400s in Europe. If you want to read a book, there's no bookstore to walk into, no library full of shelves, and definitely no Add to Cart button. Every single book has to be copied by hand, letter by letter, page by page, by monks or scribes working in candlelit rooms. It could take months, even years, to finish just one manuscript. Books were rare, expensive, and often locked away in monasteries or the private collections of the elite. Knowledge moved slowly, guarded carefully, and reaching only a tiny fraction of society. And then, in a small workshop in Mainz, Germany, a man named Johannes Gutenberg changed the world. Around 1436, Gutenberg invented something deceptively simple but absolutely revolutionary: the movable metal-type printing press. He took the basic mechanism of a wine press, a familiar tool in his region, and combined it with small, individual metal letters cast in lead. These letters could be arranged to form words, inked, and pressed onto paper. Once a page was done, the letters could be rearranged and reused for the next one. This meant a single machine could print the same text over and over again with incredible speed and consistency. It's hard to overstate how groundbreaking this was. Before Gutenberg, making a single book was a labor of devotion. After Gutenberg, producing multiple copies became a matter of weeks rather than years. For the first time, ideas could spread as fast as the presses could turn. Within just a few decades, the impact was visible everywhere. Hundreds of cities across Europe had set up printing shops. These places became lively centers of culture, buzzing with the sounds of wooden presses and the smell of fresh ink. The very first major printed work was the Gutenberg Bible, completed around 1455. It wasn't just a religious text, it was a stunning piece of craftsmanship with its crisp typeface and beautiful layout. It proved that printed books could rival handwritten manuscripts in beauty while far surpassing them in quantity. Once the technology proved itself, the presses turned to pamphlets, laws, manuals, and scholarly texts. Suddenly, people could access information that had once been the privilege of the few. One historian later wrote that this new technology placed revolutionary ideas and ancient knowledge into the hands of every literate European. And they weren't exaggerating. The printing press amplified voices that would have otherwise remained local. Take Martin Luther, for example. In 1517, he famously nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. In a pre-printing world, that might have been the end of the story. Some heated debates, maybe a few handwritten copies passed around. But thanks to the press, his message spread across Europe in weeks. The Protestant Reformation wasn't just a theological revolution, it was a media revolution. Science, too, took flight through print. The groundbreaking works of Copernicus and Vesalius, which challenged old ideas about the cosmos and the human body, reached audiences far beyond the walls of universities. One printer, Christoph Plantin, even quipped that, in 1500, no idea was safer than to hide in print, because everybody can find it. That line perfectly captures the shift.
In medieval times, knowledge was scarce and easy to suppress. Now, once it was printed, it was almost impossible to contain. The ripple effects of this invention were massive. Gutenberg's press laid the foundation for the Renaissance, fueling an explosion of art, literature, and humanist thought. It supercharged the Reformation, giving reformers an unprecedented way to spread their ideas. And it helped launch the scientific revolution, allowing discoveries to circulate and be built upon. Historians often call it the key to unlocking the modern age, and for good reason. With books becoming cheaper and more widely available, literacy rates began to climb. Ordinary townspeople who once had no access to written knowledge could now read religious texts, political pamphlets, or even travelogues. Ideas that once died with a single handwritten copy now lived on in hundreds or thousands of editions. Think of Erasmus's Greek New Testament, printed in 1516, which reshaped theological debates across Europe. Or Columbus's letter describing the New World in 1493, which spread rapidly thanks to printing, sparking imaginations and ambitions across the continent. The printing press also created something entirely new, an information economy. Booksellers, printers, translators, and authors formed the backbone of a growing industry dedicated to producing and sharing knowledge. Over the following centuries, literacy rates doubled roughly every 100 years in many parts of Europe. Philosophical works that powered the Enlightenment, from Voltaire to Locke, depended on this infrastructure. Without printing, those ideas might have remained whispers in small rooms. And it didn't stop in Europe. Printing spread outward, from Germany to Italy and France, then across the globe. While East Asia had already developed woodblock printing centuries earlier, Gutenberg's movable type system dramatically accelerated change in the West, making book production faster and more adaptable. It also gave rise to new concepts of intellectual ownership, as identical copies could be made and distributed widely. Authors began to think of their works as something reproducible, trackable, and worth protecting. Perhaps the most profound change was access. Knowledge that had once been the private domain of monks, nobles, or scholars became available to the public. As one commentator put it, the press put the written word into the hands of the masses. That shift, away from scarcity and towards openness, laid the foundation for the world we live in today, where information flows freely and rapidly. When you think about it, Gutenberg's press was the original information revolution. Long before the internet or social media, this humble machine in a German workshop transformed how humans shared knowledge. It reshaped religion, science, politics, and culture, and it all started with some lead letters, a wine press, and one man's determination to make words move faster than ever before.
Number 7. Golden Age of Timbuktu, 14th to 16th centuries, Mali Empire. When people hear the name Timbuktu, many imagine some faraway, almost mythical place at the edge of the world. In fact, for centuries in Europe, Timbuktu was used almost like a synonym for the ends of the earth. But in reality, this city was once one of the most vibrant intellectual and commercial centers on the planet, a place where gold, salt, and scholarship flowed side by side deep in the heart of West Africa. Let's rewind to the 14th to 16th centuries, during the height of the Mali and Songhai empires. At this time, Timbuktu sat at a strategic location, right where the Sahara Desert meets the fertile Niger River Valley. This made it a natural crossroads, a meeting point for traders coming down from North Africa with salt, cloth, and books, and for West African merchants bringing up gold, ivory, and agricultural goods. Camel caravans sometimes traveled hundreds or even thousands of kilometers to reach Timbuktu. carrying not only goods but also news, culture, and, most importantly, ideas. A key turning point came in 1324, when Mali's famous ruler Mansa Musa made his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca. Along the way, he passed through Cairo, dazzling the world with his immense wealth. He famously distributed so much gold that he disrupted Egypt's economy for years. His visit put West Africa on the global map. People in the wider Islamic world suddenly realized this was not some distant, empty land. This was a thriving region with riches, culture, and power. When Mansa Musa returned home, he and later rulers began investing heavily in Timbuktu, turning it into a center not just of trade, but also of learning and faith. They built mosques and madrasas, educational institutions that functioned like universities. Among them, Sankore Mosque stood out as a true intellectual beacon. Imagine a place where thousands of students gathered to study mathematics, astronomy, grammar, law, and theology, all under the guidance of renowned scholars. These weren't simple lessons. This was rigorous scholarship that attracted learners from across the Islamic world, from Morocco to Egypt. Inside Timbuktu's mosques and libraries, something extraordinary happened. A massive production and preservation of manuscripts. Scholars and scribes carefully wrote and copied works in Arabic on topics like religion, science, medicine, philosophy, and law. Many of these texts were original contributions by African scholars. Others were translations or commentaries on classical works, continuing a long intellectual dialogue that stretched from ancient Greece to the Islamic Golden Age and now into West Africa. The city's marketplaces weren't just filled with merchants selling spices or textiles, they had booksellers too. Books became valuable commodities in their own right. In some cases, manuscripts were worth more than gold. And that tells you something profound. This was a society that valued knowledge as highly as wealth. At its peak, Timbuktu's intellectual reputation was unmatched in sub-Saharan Africa. One expert from the Library of Congress once remarked that Timbuktu's scholarly brilliance was without equal in all of sub-Saharan Africa and was known throughout the Islamic world. Historian Kate Fleet also noted how the empires of Western Sudan gave rise to centers of power and learning that influenced regions far beyond today's national borders. Timbuktu was more than a city. It was a bridge between African and Mediterranean civilizations, a place where cultures met, exchanged ideas, and grew richer through that exchange. The impact of Timbuktu's golden age rippled far beyond its city walls. For centuries, scholars from North Africa and the wider Muslim world traveled south to study in its institutions. It showed that Africa was not isolated from global intellectual currents. It was actively shaping them. Timbuktu's libraries preserved scientific and philosophical texts that Europe wouldn't encounter again until much later. It became a symbol of African sophistication and intellectual power, directly challenging stereotypes that painted the continent as culturally or scientifically stagnant. Unfortunately, Timbuktu's fortunes changed over time. Political instability in the Sahel region, along with shifting trade routes, eventually led to its decline. But its intellectual legacy didn't disappear. For centuries,
thousands of manuscripts lay hidden in private family collections, safeguarded through wars and colonization. It wasn't until the late 20th century that historians and archivists began systematically rediscovering them. What they found was astonishing: a vast written record of African scholarship that forced many to rewrite their understanding of history. Globally, Timbuktu became almost legendary. European explorers in the 18th and 19th centuries spoke of it as a fabled city of gold and wisdom. While some of their stories were exaggerated, they were rooted in real history, an era when Timbuktu's scholars shaped debates on law, science, and religion, and when its traders connected continents. Today, many of Timbuktu's manuscripts are being carefully preserved and digitized. They're helping historians piece together the true picture of Africa's intellectual contributions. These texts are more than old documents. They're evidence of a thriving, literate, curious society, one that was fully part of the global exchange of knowledge. The story of Timbuktu's golden age reminds us that centers of learning have existed all across the world, not just in Europe or Asia. It shows how ideas can flourish in unexpected places, how trade and scholarship can transform a desert city into a global hub, and how the written word can carry a civilization's legacy through time.
Number 8. Dutch Tulip Mania, 1636 to 1637, Netherlands. When you think of financial bubbles, your mind might jump to the stock market crash of 1929, the dot-com boom of the late 90s, or maybe even the rise and fall of cryptocurrencies. But centuries before Bitcoin or Wall Street, in a country famous for its windmills and canals, a very different kind of craze gripped society. And it wasn't about gold or oil. It was about flowers. Welcome to the story of Dutch Tulip Mania, one of the most fascinating and misunderstood economic episodes in history. Let's set the scene. It's the 1630s, and the Netherlands is in the middle of its golden age. Dutch ships sail around the world, trading spices and goods from Asia. Amsterdam has become one of Europe's wealthiest cities. Art, science, and commerce are flourishing. This is the world of Rembrandt, bustling ports, and thriving merchant families. Amid all this prosperity, a new obsession begins to take root. Tulips. Originally brought from the Ottoman Empire, tulips were unlike anything Europeans had seen before. Their rich colors and unusual shapes made them exotic and elegant. Soon, they became a status symbol. Owning rare tulip bulbs wasn't just about having a nice garden. It was a way to show off your wealth, taste, and connections, much like owning luxury watches or designer handbags today. As demand grew, something interesting happened. A market formed, not just for buying and selling tulips, but for speculating on their future prices. In Amsterdam and Haarlem, traders began to meet in taverns and marketplaces to buy and sell tulip bulbs through futures contracts. Essentially, people were making deals to purchase bulbs at a later date, betting that prices would keep rising. The rarer the bulb, the more valuable it became, and none were more coveted than the legendary Semper Augustus, a tulip with delicate, flame-like patterns on its petals. It was considered the pinnacle of tulip beauty, and its price reflected that. At the peak of the craze, a single tulip bulb could sell for the equivalent of a skilled craftsman's entire yearly salary. Some reports even suggest that certain bulbs were traded for the value of a house. People from different walks of life got involved: merchants, artisans, and even farmers. Everyone wanted a piece of the action. But as we know from many other booms in history, what goes up eventually comes down. In early 1637, the market suddenly collapsed. Buyers began to disappear. At one auction in Harlem, the usual crowd simply didn't show up. Without buyers, prices plummeted almost overnight. Sellers were left holding bulbs that were now practically worthless. What had been a frenzy of optimism turned into panic. The number of people actually involved in this tulip trading bubble was relatively small, probably just a few thousand, but the story captured the imagination of the entire country. News pamphlets of the time portrayed it as a disaster. People were shocked and, in some cases, amused by how far the obsession had gone. Later generations of writers and economists mythologized tulip mania as the first major speculative bubble in history, a perfect cautionary tale about greed, herd behavior, and irrational markets. For centuries, people believed that the crash had devastated the Dutch economy, plunging it into a depression. But modern research paints a more nuanced picture. Economic historian Anne Goldgar went back to the original archives and discovered something surprising. The impact was actually quite limited. Very few people went bankrupt, and the broader economy continued to thrive. Another historian, Mackay, observed that the tulip crash had no measurable impact on the overall economy. In other words, while it caused some local turmoil and reputational damage, it wasn't the economic apocalypse that later stories made it out to be. So, why does tulip mania matter so much? The real significance lies not in the size of the crash, but in its symbolism. It became one of the earliest and most vivid examples of how human psychology can drive markets to irrational extremes. People got caught up in the excitement, convinced that prices would keep climbing forever. Even though the economic damage was minimal, the episode stuck in collective memory. Tulip mania entered plays, literature, and economic thought. It became a reference point for every future bubble, whether it was railway stocks in the 19th century, the 1920s stock market, the housing bubble of 2008, or the surge in cryptocurrencies. Economists often evoke tulip mania when warning about the dangers of speculative excess, the tendency for people to follow the crowd, inflate prices far beyond their real value, and ignore the risks until it's too late. Globally, the legacy of tulip mania is more cultural than economic. It helped shape how people understand market bubbles and the psychology behind them. Even today, calling something the new tulip mania is a quick way to say, "This looks like a bubble waiting to burst." In the end, the Dutch economy quickly recovered, but the story of tulip mania lived on, growing bigger, more dramatic, and more symbolic with every retelling. It's a reminder that markets aren't just driven by numbers, they're driven by people, their hopes, their fears, and sometimes their collective madness over something as simple as a flower.
Number 9. Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, Saint-Domingue, Haiti. If you were to list the most influential revolutions in history, chances are you'd think of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, maybe the Russian Revolution. But there's another one, a revolution just as groundbreaking, maybe even more radical, that often gets far less attention. It took place on a Caribbean island, in what was then the wealthiest colony in the Americas, and it was led not by aristocrats or philosophers, but by enslaved people. This is the story of the Haitian Revolution, a movement that changed the world. Let's set the scene. In the late 18th century, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, was the jewel of the French Empire. Its fertile plantations produced staggering amounts of sugar and coffee, commodities that were incredibly valuable in Europe. In fact, Saint-Domingue was responsible for more wealth than any other colony in the Americas. But that wealth came at a horrific cost. The colony was built on the backs of enslaved Africans, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population. Living and working conditions were brutal. Long hours under the tropical sun, violent punishments, and a system designed to crush resistance. Death rates were so high that the slave population had to be constantly replenished through the transatlantic slave trade. But across the ocean, something unexpected was happening. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, proclaiming ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. These ideas didn't stay in Paris, they traveled. News of the revolution reached the Caribbean, and the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue began to ask a dangerous question. If freedom and equality are universal rights, then why not us? In 1791, that question turned into action. Enslaved men and women across the colony rose up in revolt. What began as local uprisings quickly evolved into a massive, organized revolution. Among their leaders was a remarkable man, Toussaint Louverture. A former slave himself, Toussaint combined military brilliance with diplomatic skill. Over the next decade, he and other leaders would guide the revolution through one of the most complex and intense struggles of the era. This was no short rebellion. It became a protracted war of liberation, involving multiple armies and shifting alliances. The rebels fought not only French colonial authorities, but also invading Spanish and British forces, each hoping to gain control of the lucrative colony. The revolutionaries used a mix of guerrilla warfare, taking advantage of their knowledge of the terrain, and more conventional military tactics. Over time, their forces grew more disciplined and formidable. By 1801, Toussaint Louverture controlled much of the colony. He even issued a constitution, declaring himself governor for life and abolishing slavery. It was a bold statement to the world. Saint-Domingue was charting its own path. But across the Atlantic, a new ruler had emerged in France, Napoleon Bonaparte. Determined to rebuild France's overseas empire, Napoleon sent a massive expedition in 1802, one of the largest of its kind, to crush the revolution and restore slavery. At first, the French forces made gains, and Toussaint was eventually captured and deported to France, where he died in prison. But his death did not end the revolution. The fighters in Saint-Domingue regrouped under new leaders, including Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and continued their struggle with unrelenting determination. The French troops, ravaged by disease, unfamiliar terrain, and fierce resistance, began to falter. By 1804, after more than a decade of fighting, the revolutionaries emerged victorious. They declared the independence of Haiti, making it the first nation in history founded by formerly enslaved people. The consequences of this victory were immense. First, the Haitian Revolution was a unique historical event. The only successful slave revolt
that resulted in the founding of a sovereign nation. It sent shockwaves across the Atlantic world. In slave-holding societies, from the American South to Brazil to the Caribbean, elites were terrified. If the enslaved population of Haiti could overthrow one of Europe's greatest powers, what might happen in their own backyards? Uprisings flared, and colonial rulers tightened controls in fear of similar revolutions. The revolution also reshaped global geopolitics. Napoleon's failure to retake Haiti convinced him to abandon France's New World ambitions. In 1803, he sold the vast Louisiana territory to the United States, doubling the size of the young republic in what became known as the Louisiana Purchase. In other words, the Haitian Revolution directly influenced the map of North America. In Europe, the sight of a black-led army defeating French imperial troops forced new debates about slavery, race, and empire. It contributed to growing pressure in Britain and France to abolish the slave trade, with Britain eventually banning it in 1807. It also inspired anti-colonial thinkers and future independence leaders in Latin America. Haiti became a symbol of universal liberty, proving that the ideals of freedom didn't just belong to Europeans, they could be claimed by anyone. Of course, Haiti's story after independence was complicated. The new nation faced diplomatic isolation. Former colonial powers refused to recognize its independence for decades, and in 1825, France imposed a massive indemnity payment in exchange for recognition, essentially forcing Haiti to pay reparations to former slaveholders. This debt crippled Haiti's economy for generations. But despite these challenges, the moral legacy of the revolution endured. The Haitian Revolution was a turning point. It reshaped colonial empires, accelerated debates on human rights, and shattered the myth that European armies were unbeatable. It forced the world to confront the radical idea that freedom could belong to everyone, no matter their race, status, or origin. And yet, despite its enormous impact, this revolution is often overlooked in mainstream history. But without it, the global story of slavery, empire, and independence would look very different. Haiti's fight for freedom didn't just change a colony, it changed the world.
Number 10. Eruption of Mount Tambora, 1815, Dutch East Indies, Indonesia.
Imagine waking up one morning to find that summer never arrives. The skies stay gray for months, crops wither in the fields, rivers freeze in the middle of July, and snow falls where it shouldn't. People grow hungry, diseases spread, and the world seems to tilt into a strange, cold twilight. It sounds like the plot of a dystopian novel, but this actually happened in 1816 across large parts of the world. And it all started a year earlier on a remote island in what is now Indonesia, with one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in recorded history. On April 5, 1815, Mount Tambora, a volcano on the island of Sumbawa, erupted with unimaginable force. Scientists classify eruptions on a scale called the Volcanic Explosivity Index, or VEI. Tambora reached VEI 7, placing it among the largest eruptions ever. To put that into perspective, it was about 100 times more powerful than Mount St. Helens in 1980. The explosion was so loud that it was heard over 2,000 kilometers away. Reports say people in Sumatra thought it was cannon fire. Over the following days, huge plumes of ash and sulfur gases shot high into the stratosphere, far above the clouds where weather happens. This was the key. Up there, winds carried the particles around the globe, forming a thin, hazy layer that began to block sunlight. Tambora didn't just affect its immediate surroundings, it effectively tinkered with the Earth's climate system. The impact was dramatic. Scientists estimate that global temperatures dropped by about 3 degrees Celsius, an enormous shift for climate standards. In Europe and North America, 1816 became known as the year without a summer. Imagine late June, but instead of warm days and blooming fields, you get frost, snow, and failed harvests. In parts of New England and Canada, there were reports of ice forming on lakes in midsummer. In Europe, heavy rains and cold snaps ruined crops. Rivers like the Thames froze unusually late into the year. Across Asia, particularly in China, monsoon patterns shifted, triggering droughts and crop failures. These weren't isolated weather oddities. They were the direct result of volcanic ash spreading across the entire planet, dimming the sun. The consequences were devastating. With harvests failing, food prices soared. Famine spread through regions already on the edge of subsistence. In Europe, desperate communities rioted over bread and grain shortages. In North America, families migrated westward in search of better conditions, helping shape new settlement patterns. Even culture was affected in unexpected ways. In the summer of 1816, a group of young writers found themselves trapped indoors by unrelenting cold and rain during their stay at Lake Geneva in Switzerland. Among them was Mary Shelley, who began writing a story to pass the time, one that would become Frankenstein, a tale born out of volcanic gloom. Across the continent, artists painted moody, dramatic skies, inspired by the strange light caused by volcanic particles in the atmosphere. Even Beethoven's somber compositions from that year have been interpreted as reflecting this darker, unsettled world. But beyond the human stories, Tambora offered something else, a lesson in how deeply interconnected our planet is. A volcanic eruption on a remote Indonesian island managed to disrupt agriculture, trade, migration, and culture across multiple continents. Economically, Tambora acted like a sudden shock to the global system. Grain markets in Europe and North America were thrown into turmoil as harvests failed. Prices spiked, shortages worsened, and people experienced firsthand how a single environmental event could ripple through markets thousands of kilometers away. Politically and socially, the famine fueled unrest. In places like Italy, grain shortages led to revolts. In China, the disrupted monsoon caused widespread famine and hardship. Disease outbreaks followed in many regions, as weakened populations became more vulnerable to epidemics. Interestingly, the disaster also pushed innovation. Governments, scientists, and farmers began to pay closer attention to weather records and agricultural techniques. Some historians argue that Tambora helped spur the development of modern meteorology as people realized the need to understand and prepare for such global climatic events. Ecologically, Tambora's eruption altered weather patterns for years. Its effects are still studied today by climate scientists as a kind of natural experiment. By analyzing ice cores, tree rings, and historical records, researchers have been able to trace how this single eruption affected everything from rainfall to crop cycles across the world. It's one of the clearest examples we have of how volcanoes can trigger rapid, global climate change, not over centuries, but in a matter of months. Tambora's legacy reaches far beyond its physical eruption. It's a story that connects geology, climate, economics, and culture. It reminds us that our world is a delicately balanced system,
where an event in one corner can echo across continents. Today, when scientists model the potential impact of future super-eruptions or even geoengineering projects, they often look back to Tambora as a test case, a real-world example of how atmospheric changes can affect human society on a global scale. The eruption of Mount Tambora wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a planetary event, one that plunged the world into an unexpected winter, changed human migration and culture, and left a scientific legacy that continues to shape how we understand our climate today.
Number 11. Great Irish Famine, 1845 to 1849, Ireland. Imagine relying on a single crop, one plant, to feed most of your population. And then, almost overnight, that crop begins to rot in the ground. Year after year, the fields fail, people starve, and the world watches as a local agricultural disaster turns into a national tragedy. This is the story of the Great Irish Famine, one of the most devastating events in 19th century history. Let's go back to the 1840s. At that time, Ireland was under British rule, and its economy was tightly bound to Britain's. Most of the population lived in rural areas and depended almost entirely on the potato as their staple food. Why potatoes? Because they were cheap, easy to grow, and incredibly nutritious. A single acre of potatoes could feed a family for a year. For the poorer classes, especially tenant farmers, potatoes weren't just part of the diet, they were the diet. But in 1845, something invisible to the naked eye appeared in the fields. Phytophthora infestans, a fungal disease known as potato blight. It spread quickly, turning healthy potato plants into black, stinking mush almost overnight. The first year was disastrous, but worse was to come. The blight struck again the following year, and then again. It wasn't a one-time failure. It was a chain of failed harvests that stretched for years. Ireland's population at the time was around 8.4 million people, and the vast majority depended on this single crop. When the potatoes failed, they had little else to fall back on. But the tragedy wasn't just biological, it was political and economic. Ireland was part of the British Empire, and even during the famine, food continued to be exported from Ireland to Britain. In other words, while Irish families starved, ships laden with grain and livestock were leaving Irish ports for foreign markets. The British government's response made things worse. Guided by laissez-faire economic ideology, the belief that markets should regulate themselves, relief efforts were slow, limited, and often counterproductive. Officials hesitated to intervene in trade or offer meaningful aid, fearing it would distort the market. In practice, this meant that when people most needed support, the government largely stepped back. The result was catastrophic. From 1845 to 1851, Ireland's population fell from roughly 8.4 million to 6.6 million. Around 1 million people died, many from starvation or diseases made worse by malnutrition. Another 2 million emigrated, fleeing the island on what became known as coffin ships, overcrowded vessels crossing the Atlantic, often with appalling conditions on board. Many didn't survive the journey. For those who stayed, life was brutal. Fields of rotting potatoes became a common sight. People crowded into towns and cities,
searching for food or work, overwhelming poorhouses and relief centers. Contemporary sketches and eyewitness accounts depict emaciated families, children with hollow eyes, and mass graves hastily dug to accommodate the dead. It's hard to overstate the sense of despair that hung over Ireland during those years. But the famine's impact didn't stop at Ireland's shores. The Irish diaspora reshaped societies around the world. Millions of Irish people settled in North America, particularly in the United States and Canada, as well as in Britain and Australia. By 1900, about a third of New York City's population was either Irish-born or of Irish descent. These communities played major roles in shaping urban politics, culture, and labor movements. In New York, for example, Irish immigrants became a powerful political force, influencing everything from city hall to police departments. The famine also left deep marks on Irish politics and identity. It intensified resentment toward British rule and fueled future nationalist movements. Many Irish saw the famine not simply as a natural disaster, but as a failure or even a betrayal by the British government. Debates over land ownership, colonial responsibility, and political reform became more intense in the decades that followed. These debates would eventually contribute to Ireland's long struggle for independence. In Britain, the famine sparked fierce criticism of government policy. Some argued that the government's hands-off approach had effectively turned a natural blight into a man-made catastrophe. Others defended the policies as consistent with economic orthodoxy of the time. Either way, the event forced Britain to confront uncomfortable questions about its responsibilities as a colonial power. Globally, the Great Irish Famine became a case study in how political and economic systems can amplify the impact of natural disasters. It wasn't the potato blight alone that caused millions of deaths and migrations. It was how human societies responded to it. Economists and historians often point to this event as a warning. When ideology overrides human need, disaster can escalate dramatically. The famine's legacy still lingers today. In Ireland, it remains a defining moment in national memory, commemorated in monuments and family histories. In countries like the United States, Canada, and Australia, millions trace their ancestry to those who fled during those desperate years. The famine also influenced how governments and humanitarian organizations think about famine relief, setting early examples of what happens when interventions fail or don't happen at all. Although it's sometimes overshadowed in global history by industrialization and empire building, the Great Irish Famine shaped migration patterns, political movements, and economic debates worldwide. It's a reminder that even something as small as a fungus can trigger events that ripple across continents, if the human systems around it allow the crisis to deepen.
Number 12. Meiji Restoration, 1868, Japan. Imagine a country that had shut itself off from the rest of the world for over 2 centuries, suddenly deciding to reinvent everything, its politics, its economy, even its identity, all in the span of a single generation. That's exactly what happened in Japan during the Meiji Restoration of 1868, one of the most astonishing national transformations in modern history. For more than 250 years, Japan was ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate, a feudal military government that tightly controlled society. The emperor still existed, but he was more of a symbolic figure tucked away in the imperial palace. Real power rested with the shogun and his network of samurai lords.
Meanwhile, Japan deliberately kept its doors closed to most of the outside world. Foreign trade was restricted to a few carefully monitored ports, and Western influence was largely kept out. But by the mid-19th century, the world had changed, and it was knocking on Japan's door, quite literally, with cannons. In 1853, American warships under Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Edo Bay, demanding that Japan open up to trade. This was part of what historians call gunboat diplomacy, where Western powers used military might to force non-Western countries to sign treaties on unequal terms. Similar pressures came from European nations. Japan's leaders realized that if they didn't modernize quickly, they might end up colonized, just like many countries in Asia were at the time. A small but determined group of young samurai and court nobles decided to act. On January 3, 1868, in Kyoto, they carried out a dramatic coup d'etat. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the last shogun, resigned under pressure, and power was formally restored to the young Emperor Meiji. This moment marked the beginning of a whirlwind of change. Over the next few years, Japan underwent radical reforms that touched every corner of society. The old feudal domains, essentially mini-kingdoms ruled by local lords, were abolished and replaced with a centralized government. Many of the privileges the samurai class had enjoyed for centuries were stripped away. The government built a modern national army, moving away from the traditional warrior system that had defined Japan for so long. They didn't stop there. The new leaders looked to the West for inspiration, borrowing ideas, systems, and technologies. They introduced a modern constitution and set up a parliament in 1890. Universal education became a priority, with schools opening across the country to ensure that the population could read, write, and contribute to this new Japan. Railroads and telegraph lines were laid down at a breathtaking pace, shrinking distances and speeding up communication like never before. Even the clothing and hairstyles of officials began to change, reflecting this new, outward-looking spirit. Not everyone accepted these changes quietly. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by disaffected samurai, was one of the last major attempts to resist the new order. But the modernized imperial army crushed the uprising, proving that the old ways truly were giving way to something entirely new. The results of these transformations were nothing short of extraordinary. In just a few decades, Japan evolved from an isolated feudal society to a modern industrial power. Western observers were stunned.
This wasn't a colony being modernized by outsiders. This was a non-Western nation transforming itself on its own terms. By the 1890s, Japan's modernization bore tangible fruit. It defeated China in 1894-95, asserting itself as a regional power. A decade later, it shocked the world by defeating Russia in 1905, becoming the first Asian country in modern times to defeat a European power in war. For the rest of Asia, Japan's rise was seismic. Here was proof that modernization didn't have to mean Western domination. Reformers in places like the Ottoman Empire and China saw Japan as a model to follow. At the same time, Japan's growing power eventually turned it into a colonizer itself, expanding into Korea, Taiwan, and beyond. But in 1868, few could have predicted just how far these changes would reach. Globally, the Meiji Restoration changed how the world viewed Asia.
It shattered the assumption that Western nations alone could modernize successfully. It also forced Western powers to rethink their strategies in the Pacific, as Japan emerged as a serious player on the world stage. And in the long run, this transformation laid the groundwork for Japan's complex and pivotal role in the 20th century.
So, while the Meiji Restoration began as a domestic power shift, a group of reformers toppling an old regime, its consequences were far greater. It redrew the balance of power in Asia, inspired movements worldwide, and offered a bold alternative path to modernity that still fascinates historians today.
Number 13. Battle of Adwa, 1896, Ethiopia versus Italy. Imagine a European empire marching confidently into Africa, armed with modern artillery, machine guns, and the arrogance of colonial ambition, only to be crushed by an African army that refused to surrender its land or its dignity. This is the story of the Battle of Adwa, a turning point not just for Ethiopia, but for the entire African continent. In the late 19th century, European powers were carving up Africa like a pie. This period, often called the Scramble for Africa, saw countries like Britain, France, and Italy racing to expand their empires. Italy, a relatively new nation hungry for overseas territories, set its sights on the Horn of Africa, specifically Ethiopia. At first, the Italians tried to establish their influence through diplomacy. They signed treaties with Emperor Menelik II, who ruled a powerful and culturally rich Ethiopian empire. But the wording of one key treaty became a flashpoint. In the Amharic version, Ethiopia appeared to remain sovereign, but the Italian version implied that Ethiopia had become an Italian protectorate. In other words, Italy claimed the treaty gave them control over Ethiopia's foreign affairs, something Menelik had never agreed to. When Menelik II discovered this trick, he refused to bow to Italian demands. He made a clear choice: Ethiopia would not be colonized without a fight. Tensions rose, negotiations failed, and war broke out. It all came to a head on March 1, 1896, near a small town in northern Ethiopia called Adwa. Menelik and his brilliant and politically astute wife, Empress Taitu, rallied the Ethiopian people like never before. They called for unity across Ethiopia's many regions, ethnic groups, and warrior traditions. Their call worked. Menelik gathered an army estimated at around 100,000 fighters, a massive force by the standards of the day. They weren't a ragtag militia either. Many were seasoned fighters familiar with the terrain, and their logistics, supplies, local support, knowledge of the land were excellent. On the other side stood the Italians, led by General Baratieri. Their force numbered around 18,000 troops, equipped with artillery and some machine guns. On paper, that kind of technology should have given them the upper hand. But there were major problems. Their intelligence about Ethiopian positions was poor, their supply lines were stretched thin, and they severely underestimated their opponent. When the two armies clashed at Adwa, the result was nothing short of stunning. The Ethiopian forces overwhelmed the Italians through superior numbers, better coordination, and a deep motivation to defend their homeland. The Italian lines crumbled. Soldiers were killed,
captured or scattered in disarray. By the end of the day, the entire Italian expeditionary force had been destroyed or captured. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a humiliation for Italy. The impact of that victory rippled far beyond the battlefield. Italy was forced to sign the Treaty of Addis Ababa, officially recognizing Ethiopia's full independence. This was unprecedented. A European colonial army had been decisively beaten by an African army during the height of imperial expansion. The Battle of Adwa became a global symbol of resistance. Across Africa and in the diaspora, Ethiopia's triumph was celebrated as proof that colonial conquest was not inevitable. Pan-Africanists hailed Menelik II as a hero. In black communities from the Caribbean to the United States, Adwa became a beacon of pride, inspiring future generations of activists and anti-colonial leaders. For Europe, the battle was a wake-up call. Italy's dreams of empire were checked, at least for a while, and other colonial powers took note. Ethiopia's diplomatic status rose, and for decades it remained the only African nation to successfully fend off European colonization. That remained true until Mussolini's invasion in 1936, decades later. Historians often point to Adwa as a rare moment in the colonial era when numbers, strategy, and leadership overcame the technological gap. It wasn't just brute force that won the day. It was clever organization, national unity, and a refusal to accept subjugation. Even today, the legacy of Adwa is alive. In Ethiopia, the victory is celebrated every year as Victory Day. Statues of Menelik II stand proudly, and the battle remains a source of national pride. Globally, it's remembered as a moment when history's script flipped, when an African nation showed the world that empire could be challenged and beaten. The Battle of Adwa wasn't just a military clash. It was a powerful statement that freedom is worth fighting for, and that even the mightiest colonial armies can fall when people stand together.
Number 14. Spanish Flu Pandemic, 1918 to 1920. Global. Imagine the world in 1918. The First World War is finally winding down. Millions of soldiers are scattered across Europe, exhausted from years of brutal trench warfare. Cities are crowded, supply lines are strained, and global attention is fixed on the battlefield. But just as the guns begin to fall silent, a new enemy emerges, one far more deadly than any army. It isn't armed with bullets or bombs. It spreads through the air, invisible, relentless. Within months, it will kill more people than the war itself. This is the story of the Spanish flu pandemic. The virus behind the pandemic was a novel strain of H1N1 influenza. No one knew exactly where it came from. Some theories point to Kansas, others to France or China. But one thing is clear. Once it appeared, it spread with frightening speed. The movement of troops during World War I played a huge role. Soldiers lived in crowded camps, traveled across continents in packed transport ships, and fought shoulder to shoulder in the trenches. These conditions created the perfect environment for the virus to thrive. What made things even worse was the way information was controlled at the time. Most of the major countries involved in the war censored their newspapers, worried that reports of a deadly epidemic would damage morale or give the enemy an advantage. Spain, however, was neutral during the war and didn't censor its press. When Spanish newspapers were the first to openly report on the outbreak, the world started calling it the Spanish flu.
even though Spain wasn't the source. It's a misnomer that stuck, and the name has been misleading people ever since. The Spanish flu came in 3 devastating waves. The first, in the spring of 1918, was relatively mild, almost like a seasonal flu. But the second wave, which struck later that year, was catastrophic. Hospitals filled up almost overnight. Entire communities were paralyzed. What shocked doctors was the age group it targeted. Unlike most flu viruses, which are deadliest for the very young and the elderly, this one hit young, healthy adults the hardest, people in their 20s and 30s. Many died within days of showing symptoms, sometimes turning blue from lack of oxygen as their lungs filled with fluid. By the time the pandemic ran its course, historians estimate that between 21 and 50 million people had died around the world. Some even put the number higher. To put that in perspective, that's more than the total number of deaths caused by World War I. In the United States alone, about 675,000 people lost their lives. That's more Americans than were killed in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined. Public health systems were completely overwhelmed. Hospitals ran out of beds, doctors and nurses worked to the point of collapse, and makeshift treatment centers were set up in schools, churches, and tents. In many places, businesses were forced to shut down. Cities implemented mask mandates and quarantines, sometimes leading to public resistance. There were even food riots in some areas when supplies ran low. Life as people knew it was upended. The pandemic eventually began to fade by the middle of 1919, though a smaller third wave lingered into 1920. But by then, the world had been changed in profound ways. One of the clearest lessons of the Spanish flu was just how interconnected the world had become. A local outbreak had turned into a global catastrophe in a matter of months, a pattern we now recognize all too well. The pandemic also left a lasting mark on medicine and public health. Governments began to take the monitoring of infectious diseases much more seriously. Systems for reporting outbreaks improved, and new public health institutions were established in the following decades, eventually leading to the creation of organizations like the World Health Organization in 1947. The experience shaped how societies responded to future pandemics, from quarantine measures and mask wearing to the importance of coordinated international responses. Economically, the flu temporarily disrupted production, especially in Europe, as sick workers stayed home and factories slowed down. Interestingly, the global recession of 1920 was driven more by the aftermath of war than by the flu itself. But socially and culturally, its impact was enormous. Many families lost breadwinners, communities were traumatized. Yet despite its staggering death toll, the Spanish flu became something of a forgotten pandemic. Wartime censorship meant that its horrors weren't fully documented in real time, and the world quickly shifted its attention to rebuilding after the war. Some historians even argue that the Spanish flu influenced the outcome of World War I, weakening soldiers on both sides and hastening the end of the conflict. Whether or not that's true, there's no question that it changed the course of history. It was a reminder that nature doesn't respect human timelines. Even as empires fought for power, a microscopic virus reminded the world who's really in charge. Today, the Spanish flu is often studied whenever a new epidemic emerges. During the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, researchers and policymakers repeatedly looked back to 1918 for lessons about how diseases spread, how societies respond,
and how fragile our interconnected world can be. Strategies like social distancing, mask mandates, and quarantines have their roots in those years. The Spanish flu was one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. It struck a world already battered by war, exploited global networks to spread faster than anyone could contain, and forced humanity to rethink how it deals with disease on a global scale. Its legacy isn't just in the lives it took, it's in the systems and strategies it inspired, and in the reminder that history can repeat itself when we least expect it.
Number 15. Great Bengal Famine, 1943, British India. Picture this. It's 1943. World War II is raging across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. The British Empire is stretched thin, pouring everything it has into the war effort. But thousands of kilometers away from the front lines, in the rice fields and crowded towns of Bengal, then a province of British-ruled India, a catastrophe is unfolding. This time, it's not bombs or armies that are killing millions. It's hunger. The Great Bengal Famine was one of the most devastating tragedies of the 20th century. Over the course of just 1 year, more than 3 million people died. Not because there wasn't enough food in the world, but because of a lethal mix of natural disaster, economic upheaval, and political neglect. The immediate spark came in 1942, when a powerful cyclone hit Bengal's coastline. It destroyed rice crops, wiped out food reserves, and left entire farming communities vulnerable. Normally, this would have been a serious but manageable setback. But these weren't normal times. India was still under British colonial rule, and the World War was reshaping every corner of the empire. Wartime inflation drove up food prices dramatically. Rice, the staple food for most Bengalis, became more and more expensive. At the same time, British wartime policies made the situation worse. Large quantities of rice were exported out of India to feed British troops and supply the war effort elsewhere. Transportation networks were prioritized for the military, not for moving food to hungry villages. And when shortages became clear, the colonial government in London, led by Winston Churchill, chose not to send emergency relief to Bengal, despite repeated pleas from local officials. By the summer of 1943, the situation had turned desperate. In rural Bengal, crops had failed, prices had soared, and people began to starve. Entire villages were emptied as families abandoned their homes in search of food. They walked for miles toward cities like Kolkata, then Calcutta, hoping to find work, charity, or government aid, but what they found instead was misery. Contemporary reports describe scenes that are difficult to forget. The streets of Kolkata were filled with emaciated men, women, and children. Morgues overflowed with bodies. Photographs from the time show skeletal children with hollow eyes, their ribs protruding, lying on sidewalks. Disease spread rapidly among the weakened population, adding to the death toll. In some places, families were forced to leave their loved ones by the roadside because they simply didn't have the strength or the means to bury them. And while all this was happening, the British colonial administration remained fixated on the war in Europe. Officials in London and Delhi dismissed or downplayed the crisis. Shipments of food that could have saved lives were diverted elsewhere. Relief efforts were slow, inadequate, and poorly organized.
Many historians now argue that this famine was not simply the result of a natural disaster, but a human-made catastrophe, one caused by economic mismanagement and political indifference. One striking aspect of the Bengal famine is how little attention it received at the time outside of India. The British government censored the press, worried that reports of mass starvation would damage Allied morale during the war. While the world was focused on battles like Stalingrad and Normandy, millions in Bengal were dying largely unnoticed. It wasn't until after the war that the scale of the tragedy became widely known. The famine left deep scars on India. Nationalist leaders used it as powerful evidence of British negligence. Figures in the independence movement pointed to the famine as proof that colonial rule was not protecting Indians, it was actively failing them. In the years that followed, the famine became a rallying point for calls for self-rule. Historians have studied the Bengal famine not only as a historical tragedy, but also as a case study in how politics and economics can turn a crisis into a disaster. Nobel laureate Amartya Sen famously argued that famines almost never happen in functioning democracies because governments are pressured by public opinion and a free press to act quickly. In colonial Bengal, those checks didn't exist. Instead, censorship and bureaucratic inertia allowed the famine to spiral out of control. The lessons of Bengal weren't lost on future governments. After India gained independence in 1947, both India and Pakistan invested heavily in building public grain reserves and food distribution systems, in part to make sure such a catastrophe would never happen again. In development economics today, the Bengal famine is often cited as a classic example of how market forces, when left unchecked during wartime, can magnify human vulnerability. Globally, though, the famine was largely overshadowed by the Second World War. It wasn't part of the Allied victory narrative. But when we look back now, it stands as a stark reminder, while governments wage wars and focus on grand strategies, ordinary people can suffer and die in silence if their welfare is deprioritized. The Great Bengal Famine wasn't inevitable. It was the result of choices. Choices about where food would go, how resources would be allocated, and whose lives were worth saving in a time of crisis. And for millions in Bengal, those choices were fatal.
Number 16. Iranian Coup d'etat, 1953, Iran. In the early 1950s, Iran stood at a crossroads. On one side was a popular, democratically elected leader trying to assert national independence. On the other side were two of the most powerful empires of the time, the United Kingdom and the United States, determined to protect their oil interests and strategic influence. What followed would not only reshape Iran's future, but also become one of the most infamous covert operations of the Cold War. The story begins in 1951, when Mohammad Mossadegh became Iran's prime minister. Mossadegh was a nationalist, widely admired for his integrity and his desire to free Iran from foreign domination. At the time, Iran's vast oil reserves were effectively controlled by the British through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, what we know today as BP. Most of the profits flowed to Britain, while Iranians saw very little of the wealth produced beneath their own soil. Mossadegh decided enough was enough. He pushed through legislation to nationalize the oil industry, taking control away from the British and putting it back in Iranian hands. To Iranians, this was a bold and inspiring move, a stand for economic sovereignty. To Britain, it was an outrage. They saw it as a direct threat to their economy and their geopolitical influence in the region. Britain retaliated quickly.
They imposed an international oil embargo on Iran, cutting off its ability to sell oil abroad and plunging the Iranian economy into crisis. But that wasn't all. Behind the scenes, British intelligence began working to remove Mossadegh from power. They soon realized, however, that they couldn't do it alone. After World War II, Britain's global power was declining, and Iran had become strategically important in the Cold War. So London turned to Washington for help. Initially, the United States wasn't fully on board. Mossadegh wasn't a communist, and he wasn't aligned with the Soviet Union. But by 1953, U.S. attitudes shifted. The Eisenhower administration saw Mossadegh's growing popularity, his defiance of Western powers, and his willingness to limit foreign influence as potential openings for Soviet expansion. In the climate of Cold War paranoia, that was enough to justify action. And so, the CIA and Britain's MI6 launched Operation Ajax, a secret plan to overthrow Iran's prime minister. It was one of the earliest major covert regime change operations of the CIA. The plot wasn't a dramatic invasion or a sudden coup by generals. It was subtler and more insidious, a mixture of propaganda, political manipulation, and street-level chaos. Over several weeks, CIA and MI6 operatives spread anti-Mossadegh propaganda through newspapers and radio. They funneled money to influential Iranian politicians, religious leaders, and military officers to turn them against the prime minister. They also paid crowds to stage protests and riots in Tehran, creating the impression that Mossadegh had lost popular support and that the country was descending into instability. The decisive moment came on August 19, 1953. Pro-Shah military units, backed by foreign intelligence coordination, moved through Tehran. Tanks rolled into the streets, and armed forces stormed government buildings. By the end of the day, Mossadegh's government had fallen. He was arrested, later tried, and placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had briefly fled into exile during the crisis, returned to Iran in triumph, backed by the West. The coup's success immediately reversed Mossadegh's nationalization of the oil industry. Control over Iranian oil was split between a consortium of Western companies, ensuring British and American access for decades to come. But the return of the Shah wasn't a return to democracy. In the years that followed, his regime became increasingly authoritarian. With U.S. support, he built up a powerful security apparatus, including the notorious Savak intelligence agency, trained by the CIA, to crush political opposition and maintain control. For many Iranians, the coup marked the moment when their democratic hopes were stolen by foreign powers. The effects of this operation went far beyond 1953. For the next quarter-century, Iran remained firmly in the Western camp, serving as a key ally in the Middle East during the Cold War. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Many Iranians never forgot that their elected leader had been removed, not by their own people, but by a foreign conspiracy. Historians today often point to the 1953 coup as a direct precursor to the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The Shah's authoritarian rule, bolstered by Western support, eventually provoked widespread unrest, leading to his overthrow and the rise of the Islamic Republic. In many ways, the revolution can be seen as a delayed reaction to the events of 1953. The coup also became a kind of blueprint for future U.S. foreign policy. Inside intelligence circles,
Operation Ajax was studied as a model for how to topple governments without direct military intervention. Similar tactics would be used in places like Guatemala in 1954 and elsewhere during the Cold War. It demonstrated just how far superpowers were willing to go to shape other nations' destinies behind closed doors. Today, the 1953 coup remains a defining moment in U.S.-Iran relations. Many in the Middle East see it as a symbol of Western duplicity, proof that talk of democracy often masks deeper strategic interests. For Western audiences, it's often a forgotten footnote in Cold War history. But for Iranians, it was a turning point that set their country on a very different path. Declassified CIA documents and British archives now leave little doubt this was a coordinated foreign intervention designed to remove a popular leader and secure Western control. It's a story of oil, power, and politics, and its echoes still shape the relationship between Iran and the West today.
Number 17. Khrushchev's Secret Speech, 1956, USSR. Imagine being in a packed hall, surrounded by some of the most powerful figures in the Soviet Union. It's February 1956. For 3 years, the country has been living in the shadow of Joseph Stalin's death. Many still whisper his name with reverence, while others carry silent fear from the terror he unleashed. Suddenly, the new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, steps up to the podium. The doors are closed. No journalists, no foreign observers, just party delegates. And then, Khrushchev does something that no one expects. He starts openly attacking Stalin, not foreign enemies, not the capitalist West, but Stalin himself. For hours, he lays out, in shocking detail, the crimes, the purges, and the cult of personality that defined Stalin's rule. It's not just criticism, it's a bombshell.
To understand why this moment was so seismic, we have to step back a bit. After Stalin died in 1953, there was no immediate clear successor. A power struggle followed among top officials. Eventually, Nikita Khrushchev rose to the top. He was no outsider. He had served under Stalin and was very much a part of the system. But by the mid-1950s, he was determined to reshape the Soviet Union's direction, and that meant confronting Stalin's legacy. The setting for his dramatic move was the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, held in Moscow in February 1956. It was a massive political gathering with thousands of delegates from across the Soviet Union. But after the official sessions wrapped up, Khrushchev called a special, closed-door meeting of select party members. What he said there became known as the Secret Speech. The actual title was On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences. It was a direct jab at the way Stalin had built himself up as an infallible, almost godlike figure. Khrushchev condemned Stalin's abuses of power, especially during the Great Purges of the 1930s, when countless loyal communists were arrested, tortured, and executed on fabricated charges. He accused Stalin of ruling through fear, murdering comrades, and twisting Marxist-Leninist ideals into a tool for personal domination. For many in the room, this was the first time they were hearing such accusations from the very top. Some already knew pieces of the truth, others had only ever heard official propaganda that painted Stalin as a flawless hero. The shock was electric. Eyewitness accounts describe stunned silence, pale faces, and disbelief. Many delegates struggled to process what they were hearing. This wasn't a whisper in a private conversation. This was the leader of the Soviet Union openly denouncing his predecessor. Khrushchev's motivations weren't purely moral.
By exposing Stalin's crimes, he positioned himself as a reformer and distanced his leadership from the worst aspects of Stalin's rule. He hoped to ease some of the fear that had paralyzed Soviet society and to modernize the system without undermining the Communist Party itself. Although the speech was officially classified and wasn't meant to be shared with the public, news spread quickly. Delegates who attended carried the message back to their local party organizations. Within weeks, summaries and transcripts leaked to Eastern Europe and then to the West. The secret speech was no longer secret. The effects were immediate and far-reaching. Inside the Soviet Union, Khrushchev's denunciation triggered what became known as the thaw. Censorship loosened slightly. Some political prisoners were released from the Gulag. Writers and artists found a bit more breathing space to explore themes that had been taboo under Stalin. It wasn't a full embrace of liberalism, far from it, but for many Soviets, it felt like the air had shifted. Beyond the USSR's borders, the speech set off shockwaves across the communist world. In Eastern Europe, where Stalin's image had been central to political legitimacy, the revelations caused deep disillusionment. In Hungary, for example, it contributed to the explosive 1956 uprising later that year, as citizens challenged Soviet control and demanded reforms. The revolt was ultimately crushed by Soviet tanks, but its roots were partly nourished by the cracks Khrushchev had opened in Stalin's myth. For Western governments, the speech was both surprising and intriguing. It suggested that the Soviet Union might be entering a new, less rigid phase. Some hoped this meant improved relations, or at least more predictability in Cold War politics. Others saw it as a sign of internal weakness. Either way, the event caught the world's attention. For communist parties outside the Soviet bloc, the speech created deep divisions. Some members, particularly hardliners, refused to believe or accept the criticism of Stalin. Others welcomed it as a long overdue reckoning. This split between dogmatists and reformists would shape global communist movements for years to come. In the long run, Khrushchev's secret speech marked a turning point in Soviet history. It was the first major instance of a top leader openly criticizing his predecessor's crimes, a remarkable break from the totalitarian tradition. While Khrushchev remained committed to the Soviet system, he understood that clinging to Stalin's legacy was unsustainable. By denouncing Stalin, he tried to modernize the Soviet Union's image both domestically and internationally. But the speech also unleashed forces that Khrushchev couldn't fully control. It planted seeds of skepticism and dissent within the Eastern Bloc. It weakened the aura of infallibility that had surrounded the Soviet leadership, and it showed the world that even in the most tightly controlled regimes, history can be rewritten from within. Today, historians see the secret speech as a critical moment that set the stage for later developments in the Soviet Union, including the reform movements of the 1960s and 1980s. It didn't end the system, but it cracked its surface. In a way, Khrushchev's speech was both an act of truth-telling and a strategic gamble, one that would reverberate through the Cold War for decades. Number 18. Suez Crisis, 1956. Egypt, UK, France, Israel. Imagine this. It's the mid-1950s, and the world is deep in the Cold War. The old European empires are fading, but they're not ready to give up their power just yet. Meanwhile, newly independent nations are asserting themselves, demanding control over their own resources and destinies. In the middle of this geopolitical tug-of-war sits a narrow stretch of water in Egypt, the Suez Canal. It's not just a canal, it's the lifeline of global trade between Europe and Asia. Whoever controls it holds enormous power. This is where the Suez Crisis begins. In July 1956, Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, stunned the world. Standing before a massive crowd in Alexandria, he announced that Egypt was nationalizing the Suez Canal. Until that moment, the canal had been controlled by British and French interests for decades, a symbol of lingering colonial power in the region. By nationalizing it, Nasser was saying, "This is ours now. We will run it, and the profits will stay in Egypt." For Britain and France, this was a nightmare. The canal was vital to their economies. It carried much of their oil and trade. Beyond the money, there was pride and influence at stake. Losing control of the Suez Canal meant admitting that their global power was slipping away, and that was something neither London nor Paris was ready to accept. Behind closed doors, British and French officials began plotting. They found a willing partner in Israel, which had its own reasons to confront Egypt. Nasser had been supporting Palestinian resistance movements, and Israel wanted to weaken him. So the three countries came up with a secret plan. Here's how it would work. Israel would launch an attack on Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Britain and France would then issue a public ultimatum pretending to act as neutral peacekeepers. When Egypt inevitably refused their demands, Britain and France would step in militarily, using the pretext of protecting the canal to seize control. It was a calculated move, an old-fashioned imperial intervention dressed up as international policing. The plan was set into motion in late October 1956. Israeli troops swept into the Sinai Peninsula with remarkable speed. Just as planned, Britain and France issued their ultimatum, and when Egypt rejected it, they launched airstrikes on Egyptian positions. British and French paratroopers landed at Port Said, a key point on the canal. Militarily, the operation was going well. Within days, they had seized territory and seemed to be on their way to regaining the canal. But what they hadn't counted on was the reaction of the rest of the world. Almost immediately, there was an international outcry. The operation looked, to much of the world, like a blatant act of old-school colonial aggression at a time when many nations were fighting for independence. And the loudest opposition didn't come from Egypt's allies. It came from the United States. President Dwight Eisenhower was furious. America hadn't been consulted on the plan, and Eisenhower was worried that the invasion would push Arab nations closer to the Soviet Union. This was the height of the Cold War, and stability in the Middle East was strategically crucial. At the same time, the Soviet Union also condemned the invasion, presenting itself as the defender of anti-colonial movements. In a dramatic twist, both superpowers, the US and the USSR, found themselves on the same side, demanding that Britain, France, and Israel withdraw. The pressure was intense. The US used its economic leverage, threatening to damage Britain's already fragile currency if it didn't back down. Facing mounting international condemnation and realizing they couldn't continue without US support, Britain and France had no choice. Within weeks, a UN-brokered ceasefire was in place. By December, British and French troops were fully withdrawn, leaving Egypt still in control of the canal. The outcome was a humiliating defeat for Britain and France. Just over a decade after World War II, the crisis exposed how far their power had declined. They could no longer act as global superpowers without U.S. backing. Historian David Carlton famously argued that Suez marked the end of Britain's role as a true global power. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, whose political career was tied to the invasion, was forced to resign soon afterward. For Egypt, on the other hand, this was a stunning propaganda victory. Nasser emerged as a hero not just at home, but across the Arab world.
He had stood up to two former colonial powers and survived. His image as a symbol of Arab nationalism and defiance grew dramatically, making him one of the most influential figures in the Middle East for years to come. On a global scale, the Suez Crisis was more than just a regional squabble over a canal. It was a turning point in the balance of power. The United States showed that it was willing to confront even its NATO allies to maintain global stability and prevent Soviet gains. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, gained prestige by positioning itself as the champion of anti-colonial movements, even if it had its own imperial ambitions elsewhere. The crisis also sent a powerful message to the rest of the world. The age of European empires was over. From now on, former colonial powers like Britain and France would have to deal with nationalist leaders as equals, or risk being sidelined. This moment accelerated the decline of European colonialism in Africa and Asia. It also led to new U.S. policies in the Middle East, such as the Eisenhower Doctrine, which promised American support to countries resisting communist influence in the region. In short, what started as a secret military plot to seize a canal turned into a lesson in 20th century geopolitics. It showed that military power alone was no longer enough for Britain and France. The real power now rested with the superpowers, and with the growing wave of post-colonial nationalism that was reshaping the world.
Number 19. Independence of Ghana, 1957, Gold Coast. Picture this. It's the night of March 6, 1957. The streets of Accra, the capital of the British colony known as the Gold Coast, are packed. People are singing, dancing, waving flags, and cheering. The air is electric with hope. Inside a grand ceremony hall, a charismatic leader steps up to the microphone. His name is Kwame Nkrumah. The clock strikes midnight, and with a powerful voice, he declares, "At long last, the battle has ended. And thus, Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever." For the first time in modern history, a sub-Saharan African colony had gained full independence. The Gold Coast was no more. A new nation, Ghana, was born. To understand why this moment was so monumental, we need to rewind a few decades. By the mid-20th century, nationalist movements were sweeping across Africa. Decades of colonial rule had left deep economic and social imbalances, but they had also created new educated elites, teachers, lawyers, civil servants, who began to question why Europeans should rule their land. Across the continent, the winds of change were blowing. In the Gold Coast, this rising spirit found its most powerful voice in Kwame Nkrumah. A well-educated man who had studied in the United States and Britain, Nkrumah returned home in the late 1940s determined to fight for self-rule. He wasn't interested in gradual reforms or distant promises. He and his political movement, the Convention People's Party, rallied the masses with a simple, fiery slogan: "Self-government now." Unlike earlier nationalist movements that were often led by elites negotiating politely with colonial officials, Nkrumah's movement was rooted in the people: workers, farmers, youth. Through strikes, protests, and clever use of the press, they built an unstoppable wave of political momentum. Nkrumah himself was even imprisoned by the British at one point, but that didn't stop his popularity. In fact, it only grew. By the 1950s, it became clear to the British government that they could no longer maintain control in the face of such overwhelming demand for independence. Step by step, political power was transferred to locally elected leaders.
And finally, on March 6, 1957, the Gold Coast officially became the independent nation of Ghana, named after an ancient West African empire that symbolized strength and cultural pride. The celebrations were enormous. Delegations from around the world came to witness this historic moment. Flags of the new nation were raised, speeches echoed through the night, and millions across Africa watched in awe. For them, Ghana's independence wasn't just Ghana's story. It was a glimpse of their own future. But Nkrumah's ambitions went far beyond his country's borders. In his independence speech, he made it clear that Ghana's freedom was just the beginning. He declared that the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent. His vision was Pan-Africanism, the idea that African nations, once free, should unite politically and economically to shape their own destiny. Ghana quickly became a hub for liberation movements. Nkrumah hosted conferences that brought together nationalist leaders from across Africa. These meetings helped lay the groundwork for what would later become the Organization of African Unity, the precursor to today's African Union. For African nationalists from Algeria to Kenya, Ghana was proof that independence was achievable. The ripple effects were staggering. Within just a decade of Ghana's independence, countries like Tanzania, Zambia, Nigeria, and many others followed suit. Colonial empires that had seemed immovable for centuries suddenly looked vulnerable. March 1957 became a domino moment in the history of decolonization. On the world stage, Ghana's emergence as a free nation had huge symbolic weight. It showed that European colonial rule in Africa was no longer sustainable. During the Cold War, Ghana positioned itself as non-aligned, not fully siding with either the US or the Soviet Union, giving it a unique and respected voice in international diplomacy. Economically, Ghana was a major cocoa producer, and independence allowed it to play a stronger role in global commodity markets, even influencing world cocoa prices. But for Britain and other European powers, Ghana's independence was a blow to imperial prestige. The British Empire, once proud of its global reach, had to face the reality that its era of dominance was ending. Yet the handover was peaceful compared to some other decolonization struggles, setting a hopeful tone for how other transitions might unfold. Of course, Ghana's post-independence journey wasn't without challenges. Nation building is never simple. But in 1957, the focus wasn't on difficulties ahead. It was on possibility. For people of African descent around the world, from the Caribbean to the United States, Ghana's independence was a source of immense pride. It was a beacon of self-determination at a time when racial hierarchies were still entrenched globally. Historians today see Ghana's independence as a turning point. It wasn't just the birth of a single nation. It was the beginning of the end of colonial empires in Africa, the spark that set off a continent-wide wave of liberation movements. It's remembered through speeches, newspaper archives, and personal accounts of those who lived through it, people who felt, for the first time, that history was turning in their favor.
Number 20. Founding of OPEC, 1960, Baghdad Conference. Imagine a time when the most valuable resource in the world, oil, was controlled almost entirely by a handful of Western companies. They were known as the Seven Sisters, a group of powerful multinational oil giants, mostly based in the United States and Europe. In the 1950s, these companies dominated the global oil industry. They decided where oil was drilled,
how much was produced, and most importantly, how much it cost. Meanwhile, the countries that actually owned the oil, the ones where it was pumped from the ground, had surprisingly little say. Places like Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela were earning money from oil, but the bulk of the profits flowed overseas. Their governments often had to accept whatever terms the oil companies dictated. But in 1960, 5 of these nations decided they'd had enough. They came together in Baghdad, Iraq, to change the rules of the game.
The meeting took place on September 10, 1960, against a backdrop of rising frustration. Global demand for oil was growing rapidly, especially in industrialized nations rebuilding after World War II. Yet, instead of sharing the benefits, the major Western oil companies kept prices artificially low, ensuring that consuming countries and their corporations reaped most of the rewards. For the producers, this meant less revenue for development, weaker control over their own natural resources, and a growing sense of economic injustice. So representatives from Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela gathered in Baghdad for what would become a historic conference. Over several days, they debated, strategized, and ultimately agreed on a bold plan. They founded the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, better known as OPEC. The idea behind OPEC was straightforward but revolutionary. Instead of letting foreign companies set the terms, the producing countries would coordinate their own policies, work together to stabilize prices, and assert control over how their oil was produced and sold. It was a statement of economic sovereignty, an effort by resource-rich but politically underrepresented nations to level the playing field. At first, OPEC's impact was gradual. In the 1960s, as global oil demand continued to rise, member countries began to nationalize their oil fields, taking them back from foreign companies and setting production quotas to manage supply. This shift meant that the wealth generated by oil was increasingly flowing back into the hands of the producing countries themselves. But the real shock came in the 1970s. By then, OPEC had grown in size and influence, and when geopolitical tensions flared, particularly after the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, OPEC flexed its new muscle. In response to Western support for Israel, Arab members of OPEC launched an oil embargo, dramatically cutting production and stopping exports to certain countries. Overnight, oil prices quadrupled. The world was thrown into an energy crisis. Lines at gas stations stretched for blocks in the United States. European economies slowed. Inflation surged. Suddenly, it was clear that the balance of power in the global economy had shifted. For the first time, resource-rich nations, not Western oil companies, were calling the shots. This moment marked a profound transformation in both economics and geopolitics. Oil diplomacy became a central part of international relations during the Cold War. Western nations realized how vulnerable they were to resource leverage, the ability of producing countries to influence or even disrupt global markets. In response, they developed strategies to reduce this vulnerability, including creating strategic petroleum reserves and diversifying their energy sources. For OPEC countries, this newfound power brought enormous wealth. Revenues from oil were used to fund development projects, build modern cities, and expand education and infrastructure. Places like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait saw rapid modernization. Of course, this wealth also created new challenges: economic dependence on oil, political tensions, and questions about how to distribute the profits fairly. But there was no denying the scale of the change. OPEC's founding was about more than oil. It represented a larger trend of newly independent or previously marginalized countries asserting control over their natural resources. In a sense, it was part of the post-colonial movement, countries reclaiming not just political sovereignty, but economic power as well. The ripple effects of that 1960 Baghdad conference are still being felt today. OPEC remains a major force in the global energy market. Its decisions continue to influence oil prices, affect inflation, and shape foreign policies around the world. And in many ways, its existence has fueled discussions about energy independence, environmental sustainability, and the search for alternative energy sources. When those 5 nations sat down in Baghdad, they weren't just forming another international organization. They were rewriting the rules of a system that had been dominated by others for decades. They were saying, "This is our resource, and we will decide how it's used."
Number 21. Green Revolution, 1940s through 1960s. Global agriculture. Imagine a world where entire nations are on the brink of starvation. It's the mid-20th century. Populations are booming in places like India, Pakistan, and Mexico, but food production just can't keep up. Famines are a real threat. In some regions, people rely on foreign grain shipments to survive. Economists warn that if something doesn't change soon, the world could face a massive food crisis, a Malthusian catastrophe, where population growth outpaces food supply. And then, almost quietly, a revolution begins. But this isn't a political uprising. It's a scientific one, a transformation that would fundamentally reshape agriculture across the globe. Historians call it the Green Revolution. The story begins in the 1940s in Mexico with a young American agronomist named Norman Borlaug. Borlaug was part of a program aiming to increase crop yields in developing countries. Working in the fields, he and his team developed new strains of wheat that were high-yielding, disease-resistant, and crucially, shorter than traditional varieties. These so-called dwarf plants didn't fall over when heavily fertilized, which meant they could grow faster, produce more grain, and withstand the rigors of modern farming techniques. At the same time, irrigation systems were being expanded, fertilizers were becoming more widely available, and agricultural practices were becoming increasingly mechanized. These elements, new seeds, water, fertilizers, and farming know-how, came together to form the backbone of the Green Revolution. By the 1950s, these breakthroughs were being tested beyond Mexico. Countries across Asia and Latin America began adopting Borlaug's seeds and methods. One of the most famous examples came in the 1960s, when India and Pakistan introduced Borlaug's high-yield wheat. At that time, both nations faced severe food shortages. Monsoon failures and rapid population growth created fears of widespread famine. But once the new wheat varieties were planted, alongside fertilizers and improved irrigation,
The results were nothing short of extraordinary. India's wheat harvests more than doubled within just a few years. Grain warehouses that had once been empty started to overflow. Pakistan, too, saw dramatic increases in yields. Across much of Asia and Latin America, cereal production soared. Countries that had long depended on imports suddenly found themselves able to feed their own populations and, in some cases, even export grain. Norman Borlaug's work didn't go unnoticed. In 1970, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, not for ending a war, but for fighting world hunger. His innovations are widely credited with saving over 1 billion lives, earning him the nickname, the man who saved more lives than any other person in history. The impact of the Green Revolution went far beyond the numbers on harvest ledgers. It fundamentally changed the trajectory of entire nations. India, for example, shifted from being dependent on U.S. food aid to becoming one of the world's largest grain producers. This gave governments greater political independence and stability. Economically, increased agricultural output helped fuel broader development, reducing malnutrition and creating new opportunities in rural areas. Globally, the Green Revolution proved that science and technology could directly improve human welfare at massive scale. Instead of watching population growth outstrip food supply, the world managed to keep pace, defying the grim predictions of famine. For many, it was a triumph of human ingenuity, a clear example of how targeted innovation can change the fate of millions. But like any revolution, it wasn't without side effects. The heavy use of fertilizers and pesticides led to environmental concerns, including water pollution and soil degradation. The expansion of irrigation increased water consumption dramatically, putting pressure on aquifers and rivers. Socially, the revolution sometimes widened gaps between wealthier farmers who could afford the new technologies and poorer farmers who couldn't. And as agriculture became more industrialized, traditional farming practices and local crop varieties were often abandoned. Still, when historians look back at the mid-20th century, the Green Revolution stands out as one of the most impactful transformations in modern history. It didn't just change farming techniques, it reshaped global geopolitics, food security, and economic development. It showed that a scientific breakthrough in one part of the world could ripple outward, transforming the lives of billions. Even today, the Green Revolution's legacy continues to shape debates about the future of food. Some see it as a model for how innovation can solve global problems. Others see it as a cautionary tale about the environmental costs of industrial agriculture. But either way, it's impossible to deny how profoundly it changed the world.
Number 22. ARPANET and the Birth of the Internet, 1969 to 1983, USA, Global.
It's hard to imagine modern life without the Internet. We use it for everything, sending messages across the globe in seconds, streaming movies on demand, ordering food, sharing memes, and even having conversations like this one. But the Internet wasn't always this vast, borderless digital world. In fact, its origins go back to a very specific moment in history, one shaped not by social media companies or entrepreneurs in garages, but by Cold War anxiety and government-funded science. Let's rewind to the late 1960s. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was in full swing. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 had shaken the U.S., proving that the Soviets could launch satellites and possibly nuclear weapons over American skies. The U.S. government responded by investing heavily in science and technology, determined to make sure it would never be caught off guard again. One of the agencies leading this technological push was the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA. Its mission was to fund high-risk, high-reward research projects that could give the U.S. a strategic edge. Among its many concerns was this: what would happen to communications if a nuclear attack took out central telephone hubs? The traditional phone system was centralized. Destroy a few key nodes, and the whole system could collapse. To solve this, ARPA began experimenting with a new kind of computer network, one that wouldn't depend on a single control center, but instead could keep working even if parts were destroyed. This was the seed of what became ARPANET. In 1969, the first ARPANET nodes were connected. There were just 4 of them, at UCLA, Stanford Research Institute, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. It's almost quaint to imagine now. 4 bulky computers, each the size of a room, sending data to each other at speeds that would seem laughable today. The first message sent over ARPANET was a simple attempt to type the word login. The system crashed after the letters L and O. So technically, the Internet's first message was just LO, which, in hindsight, feels oddly fitting, like the network was saying hello to the world. The technology behind ARPANET was groundbreaking. Instead of sending data in a continuous stream like a phone call, it used packet switching. This meant breaking information into small chunks or packets that could travel across different routes and be reassembled at the destination. This made the network flexible, fast, and, crucially, resilient. If one path failed, the data could find another way through. Throughout the 1970s, ARPANET grew rapidly. More universities, research labs, and government institutions joined, creating a sprawling digital web across the United States. Scientists could now share data, files, and messages instantly, without waiting for mail or expensive long-distance calls. This wasn't the Internet as we know it yet, but the foundations were being laid. The real breakthrough came in 1983 with the adoption of the TCP/IP protocol suite. Think of TCP/IP as a universal language that allowed different networks to talk to each other. Before this, ARPANET was like an exclusive club. Only computers using its specific rules could communicate. TCP/IP opened the doors. Suddenly, any network that adopted these protocols could connect, share data, and become part of something bigger. This moment is widely seen as the birth of the Internet, a network of networks united by a common digital language. Once that door was opened, growth became exponential. What began as a small, military academic project quickly spread far beyond its original purpose. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, new networks emerged around the world. Universities connected internationally, and soon after, the World Wide Web was invented. The Internet transitioned from a niche tool for researchers into a global utility. The impact of ARPANET and the Internet it gave birth to is almost impossible to overstate. It's often compared to the invention of the printing press, but in many ways its reach has been even faster and broader.
The printing press took centuries to reshape global communication. The internet did it in a few decades. It transformed how we share information, conduct business, build communities, and understand the world. Entire industries, email, e-commerce, cloud computing, streaming, exist because of this network. Social movements organize through it. Scientific collaboration happens in real time. Even geopolitical power has shifted as information flows more freely across borders. And here's the fascinating part. This global revolution didn't start in a garage or a corporate lab. It began as a Cold War defense project funded by the US government, intended to make information networks survive a nuclear strike. ARPANET was a military research tool, but its legacy became something far bigger, the backbone of the modern information age. So the next time you send a message, watch a video online, or look up a random fact at 3 a.m., remember, it all started with 4 computers, a handful of scientists, and a project designed to keep information flowing in the face of disaster.
Number 23. Velvet Revolution, 1989, Czechoslovakia. Imagine standing in a freezing square in Prague in late November 1989. It's dark, it's cold, and yet tens of thousands of people are out there with you, holding candles, jingling keys, and chanting for freedom. There's no violence, no chaos, just a collective determination that something has to change. Within 2 weeks, the government that had ruled for 4 decades will give up power without a single shot fired. This is the story of the Velvet Revolution, a moment when ordinary people brought down a totalitarian regime using nothing but their voices, their courage, and their unity. To understand why this moment was so extraordinary, we have to rewind a bit. After World War II, Czechoslovakia fell under communist rule, becoming part of the Soviet bloc during the Cold War. For 40 years, the Communist Party held a monopoly on power, controlling political life, the economy, and even what people could say and read. Dissent was dangerous. People who spoke out were censored, jailed, or worse. One of those dissidents was Václav Havel, a playwright and intellectual who became a symbol of resistance through his essays and activism, even spending years in prison. By the late 1980s, cracks were appearing across the communist world. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika in the Soviet Union encouraged more openness, and revolutions were brewing across Eastern Europe. In Poland, free elections were held. In East Germany, the Berlin Wall was starting to crumble. The atmosphere was changing rapidly, and the people of Czechoslovakia were watching closely. The spark came on November 17, 1989. It started as a student demonstration in Prague to commemorate International Students' Day. But this wasn't just a cultural event, it was a veiled protest against the communist government. The authorities responded with brutal force, beating students and trying to suppress the gathering. Instead of scaring people, the crackdown ignited something bigger. News of the violence spread quickly, and outrage grew. Within days, mass demonstrations erupted across the country. University students went on strike. Theaters closed their doors in solidarity. Workers began planning national strikes. The Civic Forum, a new political movement formed by dissidents including Václav Havel, emerged as a unifying force, articulating clear demands for political reform and democratic elections. For about 10 extraordinary days, the streets of Prague and other cities were transformed into arenas of peaceful protest. Hundreds of thousands of people, Czechs and Slovaks alike, filled squares with chants, banners, and songs. One of the most iconic images from the movement is the sound of jingling keys, a powerful symbol that it was time for the regime to go home. What's remarkable is how the government responded. Unlike in previous uprisings in the region, like Hungary in 1956 or Prague's own crushed reforms of 1968, the Communist Party did not send in tanks. They didn't unleash widespread violence. Perhaps they recognized the sheer scale of the protests, or perhaps they understood that the winds of history were turning against them. Whatever the reason, they opted to negotiate. By November 27th, a massive 2-hour general strike paralyzed the country and sent a clear signal: the people were united. And the regime's time was up. Just 10 days after the initial student protest, the communist government fell. Reforms began almost immediately, and within weeks, the Communist Party relinquished its monopoly on power. In December, something even more extraordinary happened. Václav Havel, the dissident playwright who had once been behind bars, was elected president of Czechoslovakia in a free election. The entire transformation from dictatorship to democracy happened so smoothly, so peacefully, that it earned the name Velvet Revolution. Like the soft fabric, it was a regime change without the bloodshed or violence that had marked so many other revolutions. The Velvet Revolution didn't happen in isolation. It was part of a larger wave of 1989 uprisings that swept through Eastern Europe, toppling communist governments one after another. The Berlin Wall had fallen just days earlier. In Poland, free elections were already underway. In Romania, a more violent revolution would soon follow. Czechoslovakia's story stood out because of how swiftly and peacefully the change unfolded. The revolution also set the stage for the country's peaceful split a few years later. In 1993, Czechoslovakia divided into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, often called the Velvet Divorce, following the same spirit of negotiation and civic dialogue that had defined 1989. The global impact of the Velvet Revolution was profound. It showed that mass peaceful protest could dismantle even a deeply entrenched authoritarian system. It inspired pro-democracy movements around the world, from Eastern Europe to Asia. Scholars of nonviolent resistance often point to Czechoslovakia in 1989 as a textbook example of how civic unity, leadership, and moral pressure can succeed where violence might fail. And perhaps most importantly, it left behind a powerful legacy. The idea that history can change in a matter of days when ordinary people act together with courage and discipline. No bombs, no armies, just conviction.
Number 24. Egyptian Revolution, 1952, Egypt. Picture Egypt in the early 1950s. The country is technically independent, but in reality, it's still heavily influenced by foreign powers, especially Britain, which continues to occupy the strategic Suez Canal zone. At the top sits King Farouk, a monarch whose lavish lifestyle, corruption, and disconnect from ordinary Egyptians have made him deeply unpopular. The economy is struggling, social inequality is stark, and nationalist frustration is reaching a boiling point. Something had to give. On July 23, 1952, a group of young military officers calling themselves the Free Officers Movement took decisive action. Led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, with General Mohammad Naguib as their public figurehead, they launched a coup that would completely transform Egypt's future. What's striking about this revolution is how swift and bloodless it was. There were no prolonged battles in the streets, no civil war.
the military seized key government buildings and communication centers, forcing King Farouk to abdicate. He was allowed to sail into exile on his royal yacht, taking his family with him, as the officers quietly but firmly took control of the state. At first, Naguib appeared to be the new leader of the country, taking on the role of president. But behind the scenes, Nasser was the real driving force. Within 2 years, he had consolidated power, sidelining Naguib, and emerging as Egypt's undisputed leader. The revolution didn't just change who ruled Egypt, it changed the entire structure of society and politics. The monarchy was abolished, ending centuries of royal rule. The new regime targeted Egypt's old aristocracy, dismantling privileges that had kept a small elite in power for generations. One of their first major policies was land reform. Large estates were broken up, and land was redistributed to poorer farmers, aiming to reduce inequality in the countryside. Another crucial step was ending British military presence. Although British forces had long occupied the Suez Canal zone, one of the world's most important shipping routes, the new government negotiated their eventual withdrawal, which culminated in 1956. That same year, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal itself, a bold move that sent shockwaves through the world and triggered the Suez Crisis. But that moment of defiance against old colonial powers can be traced directly back to the confidence and nationalism unleashed by the 1952 revolution. Under Nasser's leadership, Egypt positioned itself at the center of Arab politics. Nasser championed Arab nationalism, calling for unity and independence from Western influence. His charisma and political vision made him a towering figure, not just in Egypt, but across the Middle East. Cairo became a hub for anti-colonial movements, and Nasser's speeches inspired millions who sought to break free from imperial domination. Domestically, the new government launched modernization projects, expanding education, building infrastructure, and trying to industrialize the economy. While not all these efforts were successful, they marked a decisive break from the old monarchy, which had often been content to maintain the status quo. The revolution also had global consequences. It became a model for other post-colonial military movements in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Countries that were emerging from colonial rule often saw Egypt's transformation as proof that nationalist officers could seize power and modernize their nations without relying on the old colonial elites. In the context of the Cold War, Egypt's new direction reshaped regional geopolitics. Initially, Nasser tried to balance between East and West, but when the United States refused to supply arms, Egypt turned to the Soviet bloc. This marked a shift in the Middle East's strategic balance. A once British-dominated Egypt became an independent power with its own voice, playing both superpowers to its advantage when possible. Over the following decades, Egypt remained under military-led governments, a political structure that can be traced directly to this pivotal moment in 1952. Historians often say that modern Egyptian history essentially begins with the Free Officers' Coup because it didn't just overthrow a king, it redefined Egypt's identity, from a monarchy tied to colonial powers to a republic asserting its sovereignty. The legacy of the Egyptian Revolution still shapes the region today. It ended an era of royal rule, launched land reforms that affected millions, inspired nationalist movements far beyond Egypt's borders, and positioned the country as a central player in Arab politics for decades. What began as a quiet, military-led coup in Cairo turned into one of the defining revolutions of the 20th century. A revolution that showed how a single night of action could set off decades of transformation.
Number 25.
Berlin Airlift, 1948 to 1949, Germany. It's 1948. Berlin lies in ruins, bombed-out buildings, shattered infrastructure, and a population struggling to survive after years of war. The city has become the epicenter of a brand new kind of conflict. Not one fought with tanks and bombs, but with blockades, planes, and political resolve. This is the story of the Berlin Airlift, one of the first major confrontations of the Cold War, and a moment when airplanes, not armies, kept a city alive. After World War II, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, the capital, was also divided, even though it sat entirely inside the Soviet-controlled zone of East Germany. This made West Berlin, controlled by the Western Allies, an island of democracy in the middle of communist territory. For a while, the uneasy arrangement held, but tensions between the former wartime allies were rising fast. By 1948, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin saw an opportunity. He wanted to push the Western powers out of Berlin and take full control of the city. In June of that year, he made his move. All ground and rail routes into West Berlin were suddenly blocked. Trucks and trains carrying food, coal, and supplies were stopped. Barges on rivers were halted. The idea was simple. If the Allies couldn't resupply their sectors, the 2 million residents of West Berlin would starve, and the West would have no choice but to give up the city. It was a bold gamble, and for the United States and Britain, the stakes were huge. If they withdrew, it would send a signal that they couldn't or wouldn't stand up to Soviet pressure in Europe. But if they fought their way in militarily, it could trigger a direct war with the Soviet Union, a war no one wanted so soon after World War II. So they came up with a third option: fly everything in. What followed was one of the most ambitious logistical operations in history. The Berlin Airlift began in June 1948. Using a fleet of cargo planes, the United States and Britain started flying food, fuel, and vital supplies into West Berlin every hour of every day. At first, the operation seemed almost impossible. The city needed thousands of tons of supplies daily just to keep people alive. Airports were small, the planes were old, and the weather often turned against them. But the Allies adapted quickly. They expanded airfields, brought in more efficient planes, and set up highly coordinated flight schedules. By the peak of the operation, a plane was landing in West Berlin every 45 seconds. Imagine that. Around the clock, day and night, planes descending one after another in a perfectly timed aerial ballet. On the ground, Berliners lined up at airstrips, watching in awe as these aircraft brought in sacks of flour, coal, medicine, and other necessities. Children would wait for planes to drop small parachutes of candy, part of an unofficial initiative by American pilots nicknamed Operation Little Vittles. This small gesture turned the airlift into not just a supply mission, but a symbol of care and solidarity. The Soviets were furious, but they didn't shoot down the planes. Doing so would have meant war. Instead, they watched as their blockade began to backfire. Rather than driving the Allies out, the airlift showed the world that the West was fully committed to protecting Berlin and standing up to Soviet pressure. For nearly 11 months,
From June 1948 to May 1949, this massive operation continued without interruption. Over 277,000 flights delivered more than 2.3 million tons of cargo. By spring of 1949, it was clear that the Allies could sustain the airlift indefinitely. The Soviet blockade had failed. On May 12, 1949, Stalin lifted the blockade. The city had survived. The political consequences were enormous. The airlift marked a turning point in the early Cold War. It solidified the division of Europe into East and West. Soon after, two separate German states were officially formed: West Germany in the Allied zones and East Germany in the Soviet zone. The success of the airlift also convinced the Western nations that they needed a formal military alliance to deter future Soviet aggression. Less than a year later, in April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was established, a cornerstone of Western defense that still exists today. Culturally and symbolically, the airlift transformed Berlin in the global imagination. A city once synonymous with Nazi aggression became a beacon of freedom, standing firm in the face of communist pressure. This image would only grow stronger in the decades that followed. With the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961, President John F. Kennedy's famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech in 1963, and the eventual fall of the wall in 1989. For Berliners, the airlift was more than a strategic maneuver. It was a lifeline. Eyewitness accounts describe how people rationed their supplies, supported the effort however they could, and saw the constant hum of planes overhead as a sign that the world had not abandoned them. Looking back, the Berlin airlift is often remembered as one of the most remarkable humanitarian and logistical feats of the 20th century. It avoided war, sustained a city under siege, and set the tone for how the Cold War would be fought, not through direct battles, but through determination, alliances, and symbolic acts of resolve.
Conclusion. These 25 moments remind us that the shape of world history often hinges on events that don't always make it into standard textbooks. A cloud of volcanic ash, a trader's gamble, an imperial order, or a quiet negotiation in Baghdad may seem small at first, but each set off consequences that stretched far beyond its original time and place. When we look closely at these kinds of episodes, we see how movements like Ghana's struggle for independence or Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution sparked major social change. We notice how breakthroughs such as the printing press and the Internet reshaped how people live and connect. We also see how intellectual currents, from Arabic translations in Baghdad to the scholarship of Timbuktu, left lasting marks on generations to come. And just as powerfully, we see how disasters like famines or pandemics and pivotal conflicts such as Ethiopia's victory at Adwa or Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal could suddenly redirect the course of history. Remembering these often overlooked moments deepens our understanding of the past. History shows that no society exists in isolation. A famine in Bengal reveals how colonial policy shaped local realities. A revolution in Haiti reshaped European geopolitics. The ambitious voyages of a Chinese admiral echoed through later chapters of global exploration. Each of these stories is grounded in solid historical research, from chronicles and academic studies to modern scientific analysis, which gives us a clear and credible picture of their impact. Above all, these events invite us to reflect with a sense of humility. They aren't flashy celebrity dramas. They're quieter stories, small sparks that grew into forces capable of changing entire worlds. When we bring them back into focus, we start to see history not as a neat timeline of big names and obvious turning points, but as a living, interconnected web. Knowledge spreads. People respond to crises. Power shifts through both force and ideas. In today's globalized world, a single event can still send ripples across continents, just as these historical moments once did. By remembering them, we gain valuable perspective on how the future often emerges from unexpected corners of the past.